To anyone reading the Muslim accounts written during the time of the First Crusade, one thing becomes clear: the Muslim world was caught off guard. When the Crusaders suddenly appeared in the Levant, they struck with a force and purpose that left many Muslim chroniclers both horrified and confused. The invaders seemed to emerge from nowhere, and no one could quite agree on what had driven them to launch such a massive assault on Muslim lands. Some believed it was greed, a hunger for plunder and territory. Others saw it as an act of vengeance for the mistreatment of Christian pilgrims, or as an attempt to spread Christianity through violence. Among all these writers, only one voice truly grasped the deeper nature of what was happening. A Damascene scholar named Ali ibn Tahir al-Sulami recognized that the Franks were waging their own kind of holy war, a campaign driven by religious conviction, much like the Muslim concept of jihad. His insight was extraordinary for the time, and his writing suggested that he understood, better than most, that the Crusaders saw themselves as fighting for their faith. But how much did Muslim writers of that era really know about their new enemies? At first glance, their accounts make it seem as though they knew almost nothing. Yet a closer look suggests that this apparent ignorance might not tell the whole story. There are hints that Muslim scholars may have understood more than they chose to reveal, and that political or cultural reasons led them to stay silent or vague about the Franks before the Crusaders' arrival. Most of what Muslims knew about Western Europe came from geography books. These works, inspired by ancient Greek ideas, divided the world into 7 broad climatic zones. The lands of Islam were placed in the mild and balanced middle zones, the regions of reason and civilization. The far northern lands, home to peoples like the Slavs and the Franks, were imagined as cold, harsh, and barely habitable. In the eyes of Muslim geographers, this icy environment shaped its inhabitants: tall, pale, strong, but also coarse in manners, slow in thought, and lacking refinement. They were a people of cold temperament, distant, blunt, and often regarded with a mix of curiosity and disdain. Some Muslim geographers even struggled to describe who the Franks actually were. They debated where their capital lay. Was it Paris, or perhaps Rome? Were they allies of the Byzantines, or their subjects? Did they follow the same branch of Christianity, or a different one? Clear answers were rare. Only a few writers, such as the famous traveler al-Masudi, provided anything close to a detailed picture. He described the Franks as a powerful and disciplined people, united under strong kings and living in vast cities. Remarkably, he even listed the names of several Frankish rulers, tracing their line from Clovis through Charlemagne and his descendants, evidence that some Muslim scholars had access to far more information about Europe than is often assumed. For centuries, many historians believed that Muslim scholars showed almost no curiosity about Europe or its peoples. But new studies have painted a different picture. Across the Middle Ages, Muslim thinkers and travelers did, in fact, look westward with interest, writing about the strange customs, religions, and political systems that existed beyond the borders of Islam. What may have seemed like silence or indifference was often the result of focus. Their works were meant for audiences concerned with faith, trade, and empire, not with ethnography for its own sake. Yet beneath their words lies something more subtle, a glimpse of awareness, of cautious observation, and of an understanding that the world beyond Islam was larger, more complex, and more connected than it first appeared. By the time the Crusaders reached the gates of Jerusalem, that awareness became necessity. The Franks were no longer distant northerners described in old geography books. They were flesh and blood warriors who had come to claim the heart of the Islamic world. For the Muslim writers who lived through that shock, the task was no longer to imagine the world beyond their borders, but to make sense of an enemy that had suddenly arrived from it. At first glance, two portraits of the Franks by the same early writer seem impossible to square. In one work, they appear crude, slow-witted, and heavy-tongued. In another, they are disciplined warriors with a dense web of cities and a powerful capital. The timeline doesn't solve the puzzle. If anything, the harsher sketch comes later. The better answer is genre and purpose. When authors leaned on inherited North versus South climate stereotypes drawn from the ancient world, they painted Northerners as physically hardy but mentally dull to highlight the supposed brightness of the civilized mid-latitudes. In those moments, polemic and literary tradition outweighed sober description. It's a reminder: brief, formulaic passages in geographical writing don't necessarily reveal the writer's true store of knowledge. Other clues push the same way. One early compiler repeats a tale about women in the far north cauterizing their breasts so they can shoot bows more easily. A clear echo of the Greek Amazons, not field reporting. By contrast, a Baghdad-trained physician who traveled widely lists what different slave girls are good for and drops the Franks into the lineup as if his audience already knew them well. No exoticizing, no lengthy explanation. That offhand familiarity matters. Pull the lens back, and another picture forms. Muslims almost certainly knew more about the Franks than the most rigid readings suggest. There had been clashes long before the Crusaders reached the Levant. Writers mention Muslim footholds on the northern shores of the Mediterranean in the 10th century, including a fortified base above today's Saint-Tropez. They also note a famous battle in the 8th century that Westerners call Tours or Poitiers, treated tersely in Arabic histories, but proof that the encounter registered. When an early geographer later calls the Franks numerous and formidable, he may be distilling memories of these contacts. By the late 11th century, the Franks weren't just faraway northerners. They were turning up in Byzantine armies as prized mercenaries, especially Normans. That meant soldiers in the Levant met Frankish fighters well before the First Crusade, sometimes without realizing they were facing Westerners rather than Byzantines. Hence the confusion in some narratives. Frankish captives also filtered into Muslim households and regiments, creating everyday points of contact that rarely make headlines but quietly transmit knowledge. Diplomacy added its own channels. Frankish rulers and Eastern caliphs exchanged envoys off and on for generations. The best-known stories pair a Western emperor with a famed Eastern ruler, but there were other embassies too, including one from a powerful Italian noblewoman to a caliph in Baghdad. One account even describes a Frank in the palace staff translating her letter, first into Greek and then into Arabic. Evidence that Westerners were present and useful inside elite Muslim spaces well before the Crusades. Echoes of this traffic ripple through popular storytelling. In one well-loved tale, a Frankish king asks an Eastern ruler to return his enslaved daughter. The plot depends on courteous, working ties between courts across the Mediterranean. Folktales aren't archives, but they don't invent plausibility from nothing. They borrow from what audiences recognize. Information also flowed through Christian and Jewish pilgrims. Western travelers had been visiting the holy places for centuries, and Muslim authorities, more often than not, allowed them to pass. One Syrian voice from before the Crusades remarks that these visitors mean no harm. They come to fulfill a religious duty and go. Another local chronicler later suggests that the blocking of pilgrims near the coast helped spark a broader Western response. He may be overstating the chain of cause and effect, but his point stands. People in the region saw Europeans moving through and understood that news traveled back with them. Add indirect warnings to the mix. Reports circulated that a Byzantine emperor alerted Muslim courts that large numbers of Franks were on the move. Whether every detail is accurate, the gist is revealing. Leaders in the Eastern Mediterranean anticipated trouble and tried to pass word along. Put it all together, and the we-knew-nothing image starts to crumble. What the written record shows most clearly is not ignorance, but selectivity. Genre habits, moral messaging, and old stereotypes often shaped what scholars chose to put on the page. Meanwhile, war, mercenary service, slavery, embassies, trade, tales, and pilgrim roads were all carrying practical knowledge about the Franks across the sea. By the time Crusader armies marched east, many on the Muslim side had already seen Frankish steel, heard their speech, traded with their people, and watched their pilgrims. The shock in 1096 was real, but it landed on a world that was far less blind to the West than the most rigid summaries suggest. Travel between the Muslim West and East was not a one-way road. Around the end of the 11th century, a scholar from Seville named Ibn al-Arabi journeyed across the Mediterranean, visiting the cities and sacred sites of the Holy Land. During his travels, he met and debated with both Muslim and Jewish thinkers, sharing what he knew of the Western Islamic world and perhaps the growing presence of Frankish forces in Iberia. Men like him were not only pilgrims or seekers of knowledge, they were carriers of news and stories, bridging the gap between distant corners of the Muslim world. Through them, ideas, events, and warnings moved eastward long before the Crusaders themselves did. Trade also played a major role in connecting East and West commerce between Europe and the Muslim lands had flourished for centuries and grew even stronger in the 11th century, when Egypt became the beating heart of trade in the Eastern Mediterranean. Jewish merchants and Italian city-states like Venice, Pisa, Amalfi, and Genoa dominated these routes, moving goods, and with them, information, across seas and empires. The Franks, though less influential as traders, were not entirely absent. One traveler from Persia noted seeing ships from the lands of the Franks docking in Tripoli alongside those from Byzantium, Spain, and North Africa. Even if few in number, their presence hinted at connections between Europe and the Levant that were already alive before the First Crusade began. All this evidence suggests that Muslims of the Middle East were far from ignorant about the Franks. In fact, there were multiple channels: travelers, merchants, mercenaries, and even pilgrims, through which knowledge flowed. If the written records of the time seem thin, it may not be because the writers knew little, but because they chose to reveal little. When the Crusaders invaded, Muslim authors framed them not as strangers, but as a dangerous enemy, a people whose faith and behavior stood in direct opposition to Islam. The Franks were described as infidels and blasphemers, followers of a distorted religion that worshipped multiple gods. One poet of the age captured the horror of their conquest: mosques turned into churches, crosses replacing the Quran, and the sacred space of prayer defiled. Writers also accused the Franks of insatiable greed and treachery. They were said to hunger endlessly for wealth and land, expanding their conquests without restraint. Chroniclers told of broken promises, of cities captured under false truces, and of their citizens tortured and plundered once surrender was secured. To the Muslim eye, This obsession with material gain revealed spiritual corruption, a lack of gratitude toward God, and a blindness to moderation. These dark portrayals were not accidental. They were crafted to unite the Muslim world in resistance, to turn outrage into action. The fewer details revealed about the Franks' daily lives or culture, the easier it was to cast them as faceless enemies, terrifying in their mystery, driven by greed and disbelief. The purpose was not to understand them, but to fight them. And yet, beneath these narratives, traces of familiarity remain. Muslims had seen the Franks in trade ports, as mercenaries, as slaves, and as travelers long before the Crusader banners rose over the Levant. The idea that the Muslim world knew nothing of its Western rivals is, at best, a myth. What emerges instead is a portrait of selective silence, a deliberate choice to describe only what served the story of faith, struggle, and defense. The Crusaders were not unknown invaders, but known adversaries recast as a warning that disunity and neglect could invite ruin, and that vigilance and piety alone could restore balance to a world shaken by war. In the winter of 1250, the calm over the Nile Delta shattered. Near the town of Mansoura, after weeks of tense stalemate across a wide canal, the crusading army of King Louis IX of France launched a sudden, daring assault. The Muslim forces, still reeling from the recent death of their sultan, Al-Salih Ayyub, were caught completely unprepared. Their commander, Fakhr al-Din, was struck down before he could rally his troops, and Frankish knights surged through the lines, cutting deep into the city's streets. For a moment, it seemed that Egypt itself might fall. But from within the chaos, the Sultan's elite soldiers, the Mamluks, appeared. They were hardened warriors of Turkish steppe origin, men trained from youth to fight with lance and bow. Charging through the narrow alleys of Mansoura, they turned the tide in a storm of steel. Their counterattack shattered the Crusader ranks, scattering knights and footmen alike. What had begun as a near disaster for the Muslims ended as a decisive victory. Within weeks, Louis IX was retreating north toward the coast, his army broken and demoralized. By April, he and many of his soldiers were prisoners in Egyptian hands. While the defeated Crusaders struggled to survive, turmoil gripped the victors' camp. The new ruler, Turanshah, son of the late Sultan, arrived from the north to claim his father's throne. But his arrogance and disregard for the seasoned Mamluk commanders soon alienated the army's core. Within months, the tension exploded into rebellion. Turanshah was killed, and for the first time in Middle Eastern history, the throne passed not to a royal prince, but to the late Sultan's widow, a woman of Turkish origin known as Shajar al-Dur, the Tree of Pearls. Her rise was unprecedented. A former slave girl now ruled Egypt, supported by men who themselves had once been slaves. To solidify this fragile new order, Shajar al-Dur married Aybak, a senior Mamluk officer, who assumed control of the army and shared power with her. It was an extraordinary transformation. The fall of a dynasty and the birth of a new kind of regime, led by warriors rather than princes. The Mamluks had long served as the backbone of Muslim armies. Brought as slaves from the vast Eurasian steppes, they were trained with relentless discipline and fierce loyalty to their master. Under Sultan al-Salih Ayyub, their numbers had swelled dramatically. He trusted them more than the older Kurdish and Arab officers who had often betrayed his predecessors. The timing was crucial. Mongol raids in the north had driven countless Turkic youths into slavery, flooding the markets of Syria and Egypt. Al-Salih seized the opportunity, buying hundreds of these young men and forging them into a formidable new corps, the Bahrai Regiment, named for their barracks on the Nile. It was this force, born of turmoil and conquest, that made the revolution of 1250 possible. Yet power remained unstable. Many in Syria still considered the Mamluk rule illegitimate, and Ayyubid princes rallied to restore their dynasty. The Syrian ruler al-Nasir Yusuf marched his forces into Egypt, meeting Aybak's army in battle east of Cairo. At first, the invaders seemed to gain the upper hand, but Aybak's troops rallied and drove them back in defeat. For a brief moment, Egypt's new rulers sought recognition and stability. A 10-year-old Ayyubid prince was named figurehead ruler to appease tradition, while Aybak retained real authority as military commander. Through negotiation and force, the Mamluks secured their borders and gained recognition from the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, ensuring Egypt's independence under their leadership. But unity among the Mamluks was short-lived. Rival factions within the army began to compete for power. The Bahri Regiment, led by the charismatic Faris al-Din Akhtai, grew increasingly dominant. They acted as if they already ruled the state, distributing lands and titles, and even addressing Akhtai as a king. Aybak, realizing the danger, struck first. On the first day of 1254, Akhtai was assassinated inside the citadel. Cairo erupted once more in chaos. Some of the Bahri Mamluks were imprisoned, others fled north to Syria and Anatolia. Among those who escaped was a young commander named Baybars, a name that would soon dominate the future of the Mamluk state. After years of scrapping for control, Aybak decided he'd had enough of ruling from the shadows. With the Bahri faction cut down and scattered, he removed the figurehead Prince al-Ashraf Musa and claimed the throne in his own right, styling himself al-Malik al-Mu'izz. Outwardly, he was sultan. Symbolically, coins still named the late al-Salih Ayyub, with Aybak presented as his deputy. He even sought a distant marriage alliance in Mosul to strengthen his hand. That move exploded his fragile partnership with Shajar al-Dur. Court intrigue turned lethal. Shajar had Aybak killed. Aybak's concubines then took their revenge on her power, passed to a teenager. Aybak's son Ali crowned al-Malik al-Mansur, while the real authority rested with Qutuz, the most trusted of Aybak's officers. It was a pattern the new order would repeat for generations. A boy on the throne, a seasoned commander behind it. As the Mongol storm gathered, the pretense ended. The elites agreed only a commanding hand could face what was coming. Qutuz took the diadem as al-Malik al-Muzaffar, the victorious king. Meanwhile, Syria was a battlefield of shifting loyalties. Baybars and the Bahri exiles first aligned with al-Nasir Yusuf in Damascus, then fell out with him, sparring near Nablus. They tried probing Egypt twice, were pushed back, and spent months fighting on their own across Palestine, mostly against al-Nasir's interests. By early 1259, Baybars and al-Nasir patched things up, at least on paper, as the real danger crept closer from the northeast. Since Louis IX's ransom and departure, the coastal frontier had been relatively quiet. One winter raid near Ascalon stirred the dust, followed by a Muslim hit at Jaffa. More noise than outcome. Soon the Italian maritime powers turned their swords on each other in Acre, draining the Crusader states of the will and resources to strike inland. Then came the shock that changed the map. Mongol banners rolled over northern Mesopotamia and Iran and pressed toward Syria. Their general Hulagu broke the assassins in their mountain strongholds, toppled Baghdad, and sent his columns through Aleppo and into the heart of the Levant. Cities surrendered or burned, garrisons crumbled, Administrators loyal to the new masters installed themselves in Damascus. Scouts reached as far as Jerusalem and Gaza. Al-Nasir Yusuf tried to rally forces while his officials bargained behind his back. When Aleppo fell, he fled south, veered toward Egypt, lost his nerve, turned away, and was taken by a Mongol detachment. With him, Ayyubid Syria ended. Qutuz met the moment with ruthless clarity. Learning that Hulagu had withdrawn with much of his strength and left the veteran Kitbuga in command, he rejected surrender and made a spectacle of the Mongol envoy's fate in Cairo. The Mamluk army marched. They brushed aside a Mongol vanguard near Gaza, moved up the coast, and paused by Acre, where the Franks declared neutrality and quietly supplied the Muslims Baybars, led the advance east into the Jezreel plain to seek the enemy. The meeting came near a spring below Mount Gilboa. A day of hard seesaw combat followed. When the dust settled, Kitbuga lay dead and the Mongols were in flight. Syria slipped from their grasp. The spell of their invincibility, so terrifying to the world, was broken. There was a deeper reason this army could do what others could not. The Mamluks were steppe-bred fighters turned Islamic champions, facing cousins in arms who rode and shot much as they did. That shared language of warfare, disciplined under an unbending code and recast as holy struggle, gave them the edge. Their victory at Ain Jalut echoed across kingdoms that had only known Mongol advance. Triumph did not tame ambition. On the road home, Qutuz fell to a palace conspiracy in which Baybars played a leading part. The emirs chose Baybars as sultan, and a new era began. For 17 years, he turned a warrior state into a disciplined machine, pressing the Mongols in Syria, cutting down Crusader strongholds, and building the institutions that would outlive him. After his death, a brief interlude put his sons on the throne in name, before his comrade Kalawun seized power. Kalawun consolidated what Baybars had built and pushed further into Frankish lands. His son, Al-Ashraf Khalil, delivered the final blow at Acre, sweeping away the last major Crusader foothold on the coast. From Mansura's alleys to Ain Jalut's fields, this was the story of a new elite born from bondage, forged in crisis, and hardened by unending war. They took a fractured realm, faced down the greatest empire of their age, and drove the Crusaders into the sea, then ruled the heart of the Middle East for generations to come. The Mamluk realm entered a new phase after its turbulent beginnings, gradually shaping itself into a disciplined and highly organized power. It was ruled by a warrior elite whose identity had been forged in constant conflict, and its political culture was deeply rooted in a sense of holy struggle. Few periods in Islamic history saw the army and the state merge so completely. This was not the product of chance, but largely the deliberate work of one ruler, Sultan Baybars al-Bundukdari, who rose to power in 1260 and adopted the regal name al-Malik al-Zahir, the triumphant king. Baybars devoted enormous energy to strengthening the military. Both the Egyptian and Syrian forces grew dramatically under his command, and he insisted on relentless training. Troops drilled regularly in vast parade grounds, marched in formation, and underwent constant inspections. Continuous campaigns in Syria and against neighboring powers kept the army sharp and ensured that its unity and fighting spirit stayed intact. To sustain a force that may have numbered around 40,000 mounted archers, an extensive logistical system was put in place, although many details remain unknown. Horses, crucial for every campaign, were trained, cared for, and transported with meticulous attention, especially since most soldiers were based in Egypt and had to be moved north for war. The army itself was structured around elite households of Mamluks, professional soldiers who had undergone years of rigorous training. Baybars commanded thousands of his own, while later rulers like Kalawun expanded these ranks even further. Most of these soldiers were of Turkic origin, though many other peoples, from the Caucasus to the Mongol steppe, also entered the system. Alongside these elite units existed large formations of non-Mamluk cavalry known as the Halka, which included the sons of Mamluks, Kurds, refugees from neighboring regions, and even Mongol defectors. Their quality declined over time, but in the early period they were still formidable forces. Specialist teams such as sappers, engineers, and siege machine operators complemented this military machine, while garrisons of archers and infantry guarded the fortresses of Syria. Maintaining such a system required a constant supply of young recruits and a reliable way to support the officers who trained them. New boys destined for military service were acquired each year from the lands of the Golden Horde and transported across the Black Sea, with Genoese merchants playing an increasingly important role in the trade. Once they arrived in Egypt or Syria, they were purchased by the Sultan or high-ranking commanders and began the long process of military education. At the same time, the agricultural wealth of Egypt and Syria was distributed among officers in the form of land assignments, creating a stable economic foundation for the entire military hierarchy. This arrangement ensured that commanders could train, equip, and maintain their own troops, forming a tightly controlled but effective system. To move armies quickly and maintain awareness of threats, Baybars expanded communication routes, installing horse relays that linked major Syrian cities with Cairo. This allowed news of danger, especially Mongol incursions, to reach the Sultan with remarkable speed. Since large military movements often took place in winter when the Mongols were strongest, Baybars oversaw the construction and repair of bridges in southern Syria to help his forces cross swollen rivers with ease. The Mamluks also focused intensely on fortifications. Coastal castles seized from the Crusaders were usually dismantled to prevent their reuse, while inland strongholds were repaired, expanded, and heavily garrisoned. Baybars emphasized the morale of frontier defenders, personally assuring them that they would never be abandoned. Reports from those regions speak of garrisons taking great confidence in the Sultan's rapid response to any danger. A sophisticated intelligence network soon emerged as well. Baybars created a secret service that operated deep within hostile territories, among Crusaders, Mongols, and Armenians, gathering information on political shifts and impending attacks. These agents worked alongside scouts who monitored the borderlands, creating an early warning system that allowed the Sultan to act quickly. Baybars' influence extended beyond the battlefield. After the fall of Baghdad, he restored the Abbasid Caliphate in Cairo by bringing forward a surviving member of the dynasty and publicly receiving his endorsement as the supreme ruler of the Muslim world. This symbolic act strengthened the legitimacy of the Mamluk government and became a defining feature of its identity. His successors continued to highlight this connection in official ceremonies and even on their coinage. The integration of Syria into a centralized system governed from Cairo was another major achievement. Powerful cities such as Damascus, Aleppo, Hama, and Homs were placed under governors who answered directly to the Sultan, reducing the possibility of rebellious, semi-independent rulers. Over time, this administrative model solidified, creating a unified political space stretching from the Nile to the Euphrates that for the Mamluk leadership, the Mongols remained the dominant threat for more than 60 years after 1260. Their most dangerous opponents were the Mongols ruling in Iran and its surrounding regions, the faction known as the Ilkhanate. From the Mamluk point of view, the victory at Ain Jalut had only halted a small Mongol detachment. The real Mongol return was always expected. At the same time, another Mongol power, the Golden Horde, north of the Black Sea, emerged as the Mamluks' strongest ally. This alliance was built partly on political rivalry within the Mongol world, but also on the steady stream of young recruits supplied to the Mamluk military system from Golden Horde lands. Despite religious differences between various Mongol groups, their conflicts were driven far more by territorial claims and control of revenue than by belief. Yet for the Mamluks, this internal Mongol rivalry was a blessing, often distracting the Ilkhanate and reducing the pressure on Syria. Even so, fear of a renewed Mongol invasion never disappeared. Much of the Mamluk military structure was shaped with this danger in mind. In the decades after Ain Jalut, hardly a year passed without skirmishes or full engagements along the frontier. Late in 1260, another Mongol force entered northern Syria but was defeated by Mamluk contingents from Aleppo, Hama, and Homs. The Mamluks understood these victories were temporary and that a far larger Mongol army would eventually return. They could not foresee that it would take more than 20 years for such an invasion to materialize, but they continued to prepare relentlessly. During these years, the Ilkhans repeatedly targeted fortified zones along the Euphrates. They tried to seize the stronghold of Beira on multiple occasions, and later shifted their attention to Rabbah further south. Major Ilkhanid rulers, including Ghazan and Oljetu, besieged these positions but failed to take them. Each time news of an approaching Mongol force spread, Egypt and Syria were thrown into urgent mobilization. Troops were rushed north, supplies were gathered, and defensive measures were put in place. The Mamluks were determined never to allow the frontier to collapse. To keep the Mongols uncertain, the Mamluks frequently struck first. Their forces, sometimes regular cavalry, sometimes Bedouin auxiliaries, crossed the border to raid, gather intelligence, and disrupt enemy preparations. One of their harsher tactics was burning vast stretches of frontier pasture land, depriving Mongol horsemen of the grazing resources they needed. This alone could slow or even halt a Mongol advance. A notable raid occurred in 1271, when a Mongol army swept into northern Syria, while a larger force waited near the Euphrates. This incursion was loosely connected to a new arrival in Acre, Prince Edward of England, who hoped to coordinate with the Mongols against the Mamluks. The Ilkhan, Abaga, assured Edward that Mongol forces were prepared to assist him, urging him to agree on a specific moment to attack. But the English prince failed to act decisively, wasting his time on minor raids. The Mongols eventually retreated when a Mamluk army approached, realizing no Frankish support would materialize. The Mamluks knew of these diplomatic contacts between Mongols and Crusaders, and the possibility of a joint invasion haunted them. To prevent such a scenario, they stepped up their offensives whenever the Mongol threat temporarily subsided. Their most dramatic strike came in 1276, when Baybars led an invasion deep into Anatolia, defeating the Mongol garrison and advancing to the Seljuk capital. Although the Mamluks could not hold the region and withdrew ahead of a fresh Mongol army, the campaign demonstrated their willingness to take the war across the frontier. The next major Mongol attempt came early in Kalawun's reign. In 1281, a massive Mongol army pushed into Syria, prompting Kalawun to move north with the Egyptian forces. Joined by the Syrian units, they fought a fierce battle north of Homs. After heavy losses on both sides, the Mamluks claimed victory, proof that the military system built by Baybars had matured into a formidable engine of war. The following decade saw intermittent tension. A brief attempt at peace took place under Teguder Ahmad, an Ilkhan who had embraced Islam, though these exchanges produced little. His successor, Argun, returned to aggressive diplomacy, sending envoys to European courts in hopes of forming a coalition against the Mamluks. The famous journey of the cleric Rabban Sauma belongs to this period, during which he visited the kings of France and England, and later the Pope. Despite these efforts, no coordinated campaign materialized. Still, pressure on the frontier never fully disappeared. After the fall of Acre to the Mamluks in 1291, new clashes erupted. Qalawun's son, Al-Ashraf Khalil, pushed further into Mongol-controlled lands, seizing the stronghold of Hramgla and preparing to march into Iraq before his assassination. Under Ghazan Mahmud, the Ilkhanate adopted Islam and intensified its campaigns. Between 1299 and 1303, Ghazan launched 3 large-scale invasions. At one point, the Mongols briefly occupied Syria, but in the end, the Mamluks regained control. Negotiations later produced a formal peace in 1323, lasting until the Ilkhanate collapsed a decade later. The Mamluk success against the Mongols can be explained by several factors. Both armies relied on similar styles of mounted archery, but the Mamluks fought closer to their supply bases and enjoyed more consistent local support. The Mongols, on the other hand, faced immense logistical challenges and were often distracted by conflicts with other Mongol states. The Mamluks, fully aware of the danger, stayed focused and built their entire military strategy around resisting the Ilkhanate. When the Mongol threat was less immediate, the Mamluks shifted their attention to the remaining Crusader strongholds along the Levantine coast. Their increasingly aggressive stance towards the Franks was influenced not only by their own military identity, but also by growing awareness of Frankish communication with the Mongols. The idea of a combined Mongol-Frankish assault terrified the Mamluk rulers, who knew they could handle either enemy alone, but not both at once. To prevent this, Baybars ordered a systematic campaign to eliminate Crusader fortresses whenever conditions allowed. One by one, the coastal cities fell, their defenses dismantled to prevent future use by European armies. Inland strongholds were often rebuilt and incorporated into the Mamluk defensive network. From the mid-12th century onward, the Mamluks launched powerful sieges against sites like Arsuf, Caesarea, Safad, Jaffa, Beaufort, and finally Antioch, which suffered the most dramatic fall. By the early 1270s, Baybars had shattered much of the Crusader presence under Qalawun, and the pressure continued at a slower but steady pace. Markab and then Tripoli were captured, reshaping the political landscape of the region. Finally, in 1291, Qalawun's son Al-Ashraf Khalil seized Acre after a determined campaign. With its fall, the last major Crusader state vanished from the Levant diplomacy, remained active throughout these decades. The Mamluks signed a number of agreements with Crusader cities, military orders, and Italian trading powers. These arrangements often favored the Mamluks, who held the stronger position and could abandon treaties with little risk. Only with Genoa and Venice did they negotiate more balanced terms, as both cities provided essential commercial services, including the transport of young recruits from the Black Sea. The disappearance of the Crusader states from the coast had strategic consequences. Later, writers emphasized that if those territories had remained in Frankish hands during the Mongol invasions of the early 14th century, the region might have fallen to a coalition of external enemies. Even if this assessment exaggerates the strength of the last Crusader communities, it reflects the Mamluk belief that the Franks and the Mongols formed a potential alliance too dangerous to ignore. Removing the Crusader presence was, in their eyes, a vital part of safeguarding Syria and Egypt. The first decades of Mamluk rule were not only an age of war and political struggle, they were also a time of intense cultural and intellectual activity in both Egypt and Syria. The ruling elite poured money and prestige into building projects of all kinds, raising mosques, religious colleges, Sufi lodges, caravanserais, and urban infrastructure on a large scale. Many of these institutions were supported through endowments that channeled income from shops, houses, and farmland into teaching, worship, hospitality, and charity. This generous patronage helped strengthen networks of religious scholars and Sufi mystics, whose roles often overlapped. Alongside them, physicians, astronomers, historians, craftsmen in metal and glass, and many other specialists contributed to a rich and varied cultural life that would continue to evolve in later generations. Within their borders, the Mamluks governed a remarkably diverse society. Sunni Muslims formed the dominant group, but they lived alongside Shia communities in Syria, including distinct currents such as the Druze and Nusayris, as well as substantial Christian populations in both Egypt and Syria, Jewish communities in many towns, and a small Samaritan group in Palestine. Evidence from the period suggests that many Christians gradually converted to Islam over time, a process that helped shape the religious landscape that would endure into the modern era. Against this backdrop, the early Mamluk sultans did far more than simply fight great battles. They laid down the social and administrative foundations of a state that would dominate the region for more than 200 years. In military and political terms, the early Mamluk Sultanate played a decisive role in halting Mongol expansion into Southwest Asia and in bringing the era of the Crusader states in the Levant to a close. Their success rested on the creation of a relatively centralized government, the effective use of the wealth of Egypt and Syria, the formation of a powerful mobile cavalry army, capable leaders, and a compelling ideological message built around holy war and defense of the community. Even after the great showdowns with Mongols and Crusaders, the Mamluk state remained the main regional power, negotiating, trading, and competing with neighbors in every direction. It provided a framework within which cultural, intellectual, economic, and social life could flourish in spite of frequent wars and crises. The period often highlighted for its battlefield victories was, in reality, the moment when the basic structures were put in place for a quarter of a millennium of rule that left a deep mark on the wider history of the Middle East and beyond. If we now turn to the way Latin writers of the First Crusade imagined the Muslim world, a very different kind of picture appears. One famous fictional scene shared by narrative histories and epic poems describes Muslim warriors bringing before their commander a handful of ridiculous weapons: an old sword, a crude bow, a useless spear, supposedly captured from the Crusaders. At the sight of these pitiful arms, the Muslim leader Karbaka bursts into a proud speech, mocking the idea that such people could ever drive his forces out of their lands or repeat earlier Christian victories. He then calls for letters to be written and sent across his domains, boasting that he has the Franks trapped and will soon either kill them or lead them away in chains. It is pure invention, but it reveals how Western authors pictured Muslim power: centralized, confident, and spread across immense eastern spaces. In these stories, the action shifts to a land they call Khorasan, described as a distant region on the edge of the world, ringed by mountains and marshes and loaded with ominous, even apocalyptic associations from biblical and medieval lore. After the fall of Antioch, ambassadors from the city's emir are said to travel through this far-off country until they reach the city of Samarthan, where they meet the king of Khorasan and his close associate Karbuka. At first, these rulers laugh off reports of Turkish defeats at the hands of Western warriors, but when they hear the list of Christian princes and kingdoms involved, they begin mobilizing their forces and consulting diviners and astrologers about the coming battles. In the imagination of these writers, Khorasan becomes the great Muslim stronghold to which delegations go in search of help, where prisoners are sent, and whose borders mark the outer limit of the Islamic world. Yet this imagined Khorasan does not match real geography. The chroniclers speak of a kingdom of Khorasan, whose capital is said to be Baghdad, which lies far to the west. In reality, they are collapsing together several ideas: the eastern province of Iran that was central to Seljuk power, the memory of older Persian empires, and the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad. When they speak of a mighty ruler in this eastern realm, they have in mind the Seljuk Sultan Barkyaruk, who was then the leading figure in the Persian heartlands that had coalesced under Seljuk rule after the death of Malik Shah. The Seljuks themselves were originally nomadic Oghuz Turks, who had adopted Islam around the end of the 10th century and then swept westwards, first conquering Khorasan, then moving into western Iran, Khwarezm, and Azerbaijan, before finally seizing Baghdad in the mid-11th century. From there they pushed into Armenia and Anatolia, and then into Syria and Palestine, taking cities such as Jerusalem, Damascus, and Antioch from the Fatimids, and imposing their authority over much of the eastern Mediterranean. The chroniclers have at least a rough grasp of some of these realities. They distinguish between Turks and Arabs, often calling the former Persian Turks and the latter Saracens, and they are aware that religious divisions exist between Sunni Turks, aligned with the Abbasids, and Shi'i groups associated with Egyptian rule. In their eyes, the Muslim East is dominated by two great rivals: a kingdom of Khorasan, standing broadly for the Abbasid Seljuk sphere, and an empire of Babylon, representing the Fatimid regime in Egypt. The word Babylon evokes both the fortress near Cairo and the biblical city long linked with arrogance and divine punishment. Medieval writers add a layer of scriptural symbolism, presenting the relationship between these two powers as marked by deep enmity and constant rivalry. Their narratives describe the shrinking of Fatimid influence as Seljuk power expands. The Egyptian realm is portrayed as having once ruled Syria, Palestine, and other provinces before gradually losing them to the fierce and warlike Turks, whose military skill allowed them to tear away large parts of the Babylonian Empire. One key moment in this struggle is the loss and recovery of Jerusalem. Turkish commanders held the city for decades until the Egyptian forces under their leading statesman expelled them and retook the holy places shortly before the Crusaders arrived, an episode that appears, in simplified form, in many Latin accounts. When these authors turn to the internal structure of Muslim politics, their vision becomes more confused. They populate the Persian and Babylonian realms with kings, emperors, dukes, and great nobles, mirroring the titles of Western Europe. Rulers like Kilij Arslan and Yagi Sian are sometimes labeled kings, and similar Western terms are scattered through the narratives. This reflects the same tendency seen in epic poetry, where the Saracen world is filled with lords and barons who resemble the Christian aristocracy. At the same time, the Latin writers preserve some genuinely foreign titles. Chief among these is emir, a word they often leave half-translated in Latinized forms. They understand that emirs are powerful, but they are unsure exactly how to fit them into their own framework. Chroniclers therefore experiment with ways to explain the term. Some compare an emir to a Roman prefect or procurator, casting him as a provincial governor within a familiar ancient model. Others evoke the figure of the satrap from classical Persian history. They also play with symbolic numbers. In recounting the Battle of Antioch, they speak of 12 great emirs dying on the field, echoing both biblical patterns and epic traditions of 12 champions on each side. Drawing on these motifs, they sometimes describe Muslim provinces as realms with a principal city, 12 leading men, and a ruler at the top. It is an attempt to map a foreign hierarchy using their own inherited mental tools. Despite the confusion, they grasp some important points. Emirs appear as governors of major cities, military commanders in the field, and captains of individual fortresses. Those who hold castles and serve higher rulers are depicted in a way that resembles vassals owing loyalty to a king, while broader terms like mayores or potentes are used for the highest-ranking figures in the Egyptian and Seljuk systems. Where their knowledge is weakest is in the Egyptian case. They frequently refer to a king of Babylon, an emir of Babylon, or even a hybrid king-emir, but rarely connect these titles firmly to specific individuals. Modern readers can see that they often mean the Fatimid vizier al-Afdal, who effectively ruled in the name of a weak caliph. Yet the Latin authors never fully disentangle the roles. Their stories about Egyptian policy around the time of the First Crusade, however, are more concrete. They describe how news of Turkish defeats spurred the ruler in Cairo to move against the Turkish garrison in Jerusalem, driving them out and taking control of the city. They portray this figure, again, really the vizier, touring the holy places according to his own rituals, visiting key Christian shrines, allowing local Christians to worship, and even presenting offerings. At the diplomatic level, he is shown trying to balance between Turks and Crusaders, sounding out both sides and exploring possible deals. The Latin narratives tell how Turkish envoys offered far-reaching concessions, including religious ones, if Egypt would join them against the new invaders, and how the Egyptians tried, in turn, to negotiate with the Crusaders over the fate of Jerusalem and other cities. In the end, when Egyptian envoys proposed a compromise under which Christian pilgrims might be granted access under Muslim protection, the Crusaders rejected the idea and insisted that the holy city belonged to them by right and would be taken by force. In the Latin narratives of the First Crusade, certain Seljuk leaders step onto the stage not just as historical figures, but as fully formed epic Saracens. Among them, Yaghi-Sian, Kilij Arslan, and Karbuka are given especially prominent roles. The chroniclers return again and again to these Turkish great men, using their stories to sketch out how they believed power worked in the Muslim East. A key example is the tale of the embassy of Shems ad-Dawl to the king of Khorasan, sent on behalf of Yaghi-Sian, the governor of Antioch. In different passages, this same Yaghi-Sian is called emir, king, and king and lord of the city, which already signals how Latin writers struggle to fit foreign titles into their own mental framework. In this embassy scene, the speeches placed in the mouths of Turkish rulers hint at something quite real. The Seljuk political order is imagined as a kind of family clan, in which the great leaders appear as brothers bound to one another by kinship Yaghi warns his brothers and rulers about the danger posed by the Crusaders. The Persian Sultan then calls on his followers to avenge the harm done to the friends and kinsmen of the Turks. The chroniclers repeatedly show emirs addressing one another as brothers and friends, and in one invented speech, Kilij Arslan speaks of Yaghi as our superior and our kin. He explains that Yaghi, the Sultan's friend and subject, holds Antioch and other territories as a gift from the Persian ruler. Modern research confirms that this basic picture is not entirely wrong. Seljuk governors really were a sort of vassal, whose authority over cities and regions depended on the favor of the Sultan and on continued loyal service. The chronicles apply the same logic to Yaghi own subordinates. He is said to be king of Syria and all Armenia, and beneath him stand 4 most noble and powerful emirs, almost like kings, each supposedly in command of 100 fortresses. One writer even imagines Antioch's inner citadel with its 4 main towers named after these emirs, presenting them as the symbolic guardians of their lord, just as the towers guard the heart of the city. The details and numbers are fantasy, but the overall principle is clear. A pyramidal structure of overlords and vassals, with Yaghi as the senior figure among the emirs, directly dependent on the Sultan, while other emirs hold their power through him. Because of this, one chronicler dresses Yaghi in fully Western regalia and calls him a ruler bearing the scepter, a distinction otherwise reserved only for the Sultan Barkyaruk. In reality, Yaghi was simply the Sultan's governor in Antioch, but in Latin storytelling, he becomes the most powerful of the kings of the East, second only to the sovereign of Khorasan. At the same time, he is cast in a familiar epic role, the proud Saracen prince who ultimately fails his people. He is portrayed as negligent and overconfident during the siege, fleeing in fear when the city can no longer be held. Wandering as a fugitive, he runs into some of his former subjects, who recognize him at once, grab his sword, behead him, and send his head to the Crusader camp. The melodramatic end completes his transformation into a tragic villain of the story. Kilij Arslan, the ruler of Nicaea, receives no less colorful treatment. The chroniclers describe him as one of the most powerful among the Turkish princes and identify him as the son of Suleiman ibn Kutulmish, the man who wrested all of Romania, that is, much of Anatolia, from the Byzantine emperor. One Latin historian calls Kilij Arslan a strong man, a duke and prince of the Turks. Famous for his energy and eloquence, Suleiman appears as a great conqueror who brings Nicaea and Anatolia under his control and can summon emirs and dukes from across the east for war. Yet even he is portrayed as owing his authority to the Persian king, holding his lands from him in return for loyal service, and so he too is styled both Turkish king and, in grander moments, great king. As with Yaghi, the Latin writers turn Kilij Arslan into a stock character, the Saracen ruler who has been humbled by Christian arms. In their versions of events, the Christian knights always ultimately triumph, while Saracen forces are scattered. After the defeat at Dorylaeum, Suleiman, or Kilij Arslan, depending on the author's confusion, is imagined admitting that his mounted archers were smashed by the Frankish heavy cavalry. He waxes lyrical about their terrifying courage, their armor that shines brighter than the sun, and he urges other Turks not to take the field against such enemies. The same story is told again later when Kilij Arslan appears at the Persian Sultan's court with Shams ad-Dawl's embassy. He tears out his hair and beard in despair, recounts how his army at Nicaea was annihilated, how his family was taken captive, and how he barely escaped with his life. When Karbuka mocks him and boasts of his own supposed victories over earlier Crusader groups, Kilish Arslan tries to bring him back to reality by listing the many towns and castles in Anatolia and Armenia that have already fallen to the Franks. Karbuka himself is drawn as the opposite type, the Saracen leader swollen with pride who has not yet learned to fear the Christian knights and is therefore destined to fall. The chroniclers put many of their most elaborate invented speeches into his mouth. His titles vary wildly. He appears as Persian satrap, chief of the army of the Persian sultan, even as a kind of major domo of the court. He is rarely called an emir in the sources, which is striking given that he himself is reported as boasting to his mother that more powerful emirs serve under him than there are knights in the entire Christian host. In their telling, he occupies the very highest level of Muslim power. Lord of Khorasan, first man at court, second only to the Sultan. Historically, Karbuka was Atabeg of Mosul, a position that combined the role of guardian to a young prince with that of commander of the army. The chroniclers dimly perceive this when they describe him as both a familiar figure in the Sultan's household and leader of his troops. Above all these figures stands the Sultan of Khorasan, whom the Latin sources call the mightiest of kings, superior to all the other great men of the realm. In their accounts, he summons nobles and emirs to council, addresses them as our friends and brothers, and organizes the expedition to relieve Antioch. He is praised as the strongest of knights, emphasizing the military nature of his authority. Here the chroniclers come surprisingly close to the truth. Under Seljuk rule, the idea of a powerful temporal ruler in the Islamic world gained new strength, and the Sultan did indeed stand at the head of both political and military hierarchies. In the same imagined Khorasan, the Caliph also appears. Karbuka is shown addressing a letter to our Pope and our Lord, the King of the Persians, and one Latin writer openly admits his astonishment that the Saracens have a pope of their own. The Caliph is depicted as the supreme religious authority of the Muslim world, apostolic, blessed, and functioning as a spiritual counterpart to the head of the Catholic Church. When the chroniclers speak of the Turkish Pope, they clearly have the Abbasid Caliph in mind, even if they do not know his name. These narrative patterns are mirrored in the epic poetry of the Crusade cycle, especially in the Song of Antioch. There, an Eastern ruler known simply as the Sultan reigns in a Persian kingdom, seated in a splendid city where Shams ad-Dawl's embassy arrives. The Turks gather from all corners of the Orient, bowing before an idol of Muhammad glittering with jewels and said to float miraculously in the air. The Sultan dominates the scene as the temporal lord of the pagans, but even he is surpassed by the Caliph, whose dominions are described as stretching to the very edge of the sunset, and who embodies the highest authority in the Muslim world, after listening to the complaints of Yagi Sian and Suleiman about their defeats, and after verifying their story by a token from Yagi Sian's own beard, this ruler sends out letters far and wide, summoning Muslim princes to assemble the Caliph, then proclaims a grand pardon in the name of their God, promising paradise to all who die fighting the Christians, in a grotesquely inverted version of Christian ideas about salvation. Visual art from the same period echoes these textual images. In richly illustrated manuscripts of Crusade histories, many miniatures depict episodes from the First Crusade, and give us a good sense of how artists imagined Muslim rulers. Ordinary Saracen soldiers are shown, with short tunics, beards, and turbans. In contrast, leading figures such as Karbuka are painted in long, fur-lined cloaks, wearing crowns that are almost indistinguishable from those of European kings. Their dark skin and facial hair are sometimes the only markers of difference. Size is used to underline rank. Rulers are drawn much larger than the men around them, just as Western lords are shown towering over their followers in the same manuscripts. Some artists even combine attributes, placing both crown and turban on the same head to signal, at once, royal authority and oriental otherness. Medieval Latin writers looking at the First Crusade tended to imagine the political world of Islam as a reflection of their own. In their eyes, the religious life of Muslims was inverted and distorted, almost like an image seen through a darkened lens, and so they described it as crude pagan worship opposed to Christianity. But when they turned to politics and power, they projected a familiar feudal order onto their Muslim opponents. Kings, dukes, great lords, and vassals appear on the page as if the East were governed by the same social structure as Western Europe. Oral storytelling played a strong role in this. Chroniclers inherited the patterns and stock figures of epic songs and used them to craft larger-than-life portraits of Saracen rulers. Yet, compared with the poets, these historians also tried to go a step further. They sensed that the political systems of Islam and the Latin West did not exactly match, and they made a genuine effort to understand where they differed. To make sense of what they were seeing and hearing, chroniclers reached back to the language and models of antiquity. They compared Muslim offices with ancient Roman or Persian ones, and fitted new experiences into older categories of political and administrative order. In doing so, they mapped their own concept of a layered feudal hierarchy onto the Muslim world. The result was a kind of mirror image. In their texts and in contemporary art, the titles and symbols of Muslim authority were translated into European terms. They could not really think about Islamic structures except through the categories of their own culture. Even when they insisted on calling Muslim leaders kings and gave them Western titles and regalia, they often came surprisingly close to grasping how power actually worked. The term emir is a good example. They used it alongside Roman words such as prefect and procurator, and alongside medieval titles like king and emperor, and in this way it became a flexible label for Muslim rulers, governors, and military commanders. Whenever they wanted to stress the importance of a Muslim figure, they instinctively wrapped him in royal or noble language and attributes. They understood reasonably well that Seljuk emirs stood in a subordinate relationship to a Persian sultan, depending on him for their lands and authority, much as vassals depended on a liege lord in their own world. When they described the balance of power between sultan and caliph, they instinctively reached for the analogy of emperor and pope, and in many ways this comparison was not entirely misplaced. Their accounts of rivalries and alliances between Seljuk and Egyptian leaders, and of negotiations between Muslims and Crusaders, show that they were not naive. They had a good feel for practical politics, even if they were less interested in it than in battles and spiritual meaning. Their invented speeches for Muslim rulers almost always revolve around defeat, or the fear of defeat at Christian hands. When a character like Karbuka boasts of future victory, the narrative quickly turns this pride into humiliation, confirming the moral pattern the writers wanted to convey. Even so, the way these texts talk about Muslim politics is noticeably different from the way they describe Muslim religious life. Rituals and beliefs are usually dismissed as foul superstition, heathen pollution that contaminates holy places. Politics is treated with more restraint. The writers are capable of showing Muslim rulers behaving with a kind of respect toward Christian sanctuaries. The story of the Egyptian vizier al-Afdal visiting the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and offering candles and incense is one striking example. Yet, as soon as he suffers defeat at Ascalon, he is recast in the familiar epic role, swearing by his gods to destroy the Holy Sepulchre and to level Jerusalem, the archetypal Saracen antagonist speaking in the language of vengeance and rage. If we move forward in time, we encounter another figure who came to dominate both Muslim memory and later Christian imagination. Saladin, Salah al-Din, Yusuf ibn Ayyub. Within medieval Islam, he became the undisputed hero of his age. His political and military career has been reconstructed in great detail, and countless works, in both European and Near Eastern languages, have revisited his battles, campaigns, and achievements. In the Arabic-speaking world, his image has been shaped above all by his secretaries, court writers, and poets, whose works echo through centuries of later storytelling. They set out to present him as the ideal Muslim ruler and warrior, and were even willing to borrow and reshape biblical material in order to do so. One of their favorite devices was to draw a parallel between Saladin and the biblical Joseph, Yusuf ibn Yaqub, whose story was well known to medieval Muslim audiences. This comparison became a powerful literary tool, a way of suggesting that Saladin, like Joseph, had risen from modest beginnings to a position of wisdom, authority, and divine favor. Modern scholarship has examined this theme closely, and here the focus is on how this Joseph-Saladin analogy was used in the construction of the Sultan's public image and in the propaganda that surrounded him. Before turning to that, however, it is helpful to recall how some of the main Ayyubid-era authors wrote about Saladin, and how the story of Joseph functioned in Islamic tradition more generally. Several big names stand out in the Arabic historiography of the 12th and 13th centuries. Imad al-Din al-Isfahan, a gifted Persian secretary who moved to Damascus and later entered Saladin's service, acted as his ghostwriter and produced an ornate history of the reigns of Nur al-Din and Saladin. Baha al-Din ibn Shaddad joined Saladin after the victory at Hattin and accompanied him through the trials of the Third Crusade. As a learned jurist working close to the center of power, he claimed to offer intimate insight into the Sultan's character and decisions, even as his main goal was to celebrate Saladin as the model holy warrior. Other major historians, such as Ibn al-Athir, Ibn Wasil, and Abu Shama, also devoted substantial space to Saladin. Even when they were critical of him, Ibn al-Athir's great universal history placed the Crusader presence in the Levant within a wider clash between Islam and Christendom. Abu Shama, writing in Damascus, assembled earlier sources and framed the reigns of Nur al-Din and Saladin as exemplary models of pious rulership. Ibn Wasil, coming from an elite Syrian family and serving in both Ayyubid and Mamluk administrations, wrote a broad history of the wars against the Franks and occasionally drew on his own diplomatic experiences. Across these works, despite differences in emphasis, Saladin emerges as a central figure, a ruler whose legitimacy rests on piety, military success, and defense of the Muslim community. Saladin's active career stretched over nearly 50 years in Egypt, Syria, and parts of Anatolia. As a teenager, he joined the forces of his uncle Shirkuh a seasoned commander whose very name, the Lion, projected strength. He first went to Egypt in the mid-11th 60s, and after Shirkuh's death, he became the head of the Syrian contingent sent there by Nur al-Din. When the last Fatimid caliph died, Saladin effectively took control of Egypt and spent much of the following decades consolidating his position, presenting himself as the rightful heir of Nur al-Din and a loyal supporter of the Abbasid Caliph. The great victory at Hattin in 1187 fixed his reputation as a champion of jihad, but even then he was willing to negotiate. He concluded truces with Crusader leaders and accepted their continued rule over parts of the former Kingdom of Jerusalem, as seen in his famous agreement with Richard the Lionheart in 1192. Shortly afterwards, his army demobilized, and he returned to Damascus, where he died the following spring. Like many powerful figures of his age, Saladin was acutely aware that force alone could not sustain his rule. He worked carefully to legitimize his authority, presenting himself as a devout Muslim, a protector of orthodoxy, and an agent of renewal. He employed skilled scribes and poets to craft this image and backed it up with public acts. Letters, proclamations, and poems portray him as the ruler who purified the lands of Islam from internal heresies and foreign invaders. Inscriptions and buildings show how he used wealth to win support, endowing religious colleges, hospices, and other pious foundations. Jurists and Sufis became key allies, benefiting from his patronage and, in turn, reinforcing his reputation as a defender of faith. In cities like Damascus, inscriptions praised him as the helper of religion and rescuer of Jerusalem, phrases that tied his name to the liberation of holy places. Historians still debate how far his policies were driven by a consistent ideology of holy war, and how far they were shaped by pragmatism and a desire for stability. Some stress his sincere commitment to jihad against the Franks. Others highlight the many truces and compromises he made when it suited him. Whatever the balance, the image that emerges from many of his contemporaries is that of a ruler who revived religious commitment and wrapped his political agenda in the language of piety and scriptural models. This is where the story of Joseph becomes important. Medieval Muslim writers were deeply familiar with biblical narratives as they were transmitted through the Quran and later Islamic storytelling. They rarely quoted the Bible directly, but they drew freely on the shared pool of stories about prophets and patriarchs. These tales were woven into histories and moral narratives, especially when writers wanted to frame later events as part of a long chain of divine guidance. The Quranic account of Joseph, found in a single, sustained narrative, offers the clearest example. It follows a young man betrayed by his own family, cast into exile, tested in a foreign land, and finally raised to high office through divine favor and personal integrity. In later Islamic literature, Joseph became a symbol of beauty, chastity, wisdom, and endurance. Commentators and storytellers added colorful descriptions of his appearance and character, building up an almost luminous figure whose very presence radiated light and grace. Scholars like Al-Tabar drew on Jewish and Christian lore as well as Muslim traditions to flesh out the timeline of his life and his rise to power in Egypt. Others, such as Al-Tha'alib, lingered over his physical beauty, describing every feature in loving detail and crediting his radiance to a lineage that traced back through Isaac and Sarah. These stories formed a familiar background for medieval Muslim audiences. When later writers hinted that Saladin resembled Joseph, they were not merely making a casual comparison, they were tapping into a powerful narrative pattern. the virtuous outsider who navigates treacherous politics, overcomes adversity, serves as God's instrument, and ultimately stands as a model of wise leadership. In this way, biblical and Quranic memory became one more tool in the long project of shaping Saladin's image as the ideal ruler and defender of it. Writers and poets who wanted to elevate Saladin's reputation went out of their way to praise him. They often stepped away from the main storyline to insert glowing digressions, then returned to the narrative. In these passages, one recurring device is especially striking. The comparison between Salah al-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub and the biblical Joseph, Yusuf, son of Yaqub. The shared name, Yusuf, became a bridge between scripture and contemporary politics, and authors used it constantly. Not long after arriving in Damascus in 1167, the secretary, Imad al-Din al-Isfahan, visited Najm al-Din Ayyub, Saladin's father. At that moment, Ayyub's brother Shirkuh and his son Saladin were in Egypt on one of their campaigns. At the reception, Imad recited a long poem that, in hindsight, reads like a prediction. He spoke of two men who would soon unleash a consuming fire against unbelievers, and then shifted into Joseph language. One day, he said, a Joseph would settle in Egypt, bringing safety and reunion after long separation, just as Joseph had once been reunited with Jacob and his brothers. The implication was clear. Saladin would become the new Joseph of Egypt. When Saladin actually took power in Egypt, another poet, Hassan, known as Arkala, greeted him with the same imagery. He lamented that the Turks had abandoned Egypt to chaos and called on God, recalling that in earlier times Egypt had been entrusted to Joseph the Truthful, son of Jacob. Now, he declared, the country was in the hands of another Yusuf, the Faithful, son of Ayyub. In a few punchy lines, he fused scriptural memory with current events. Saladin was not just a successful general, he was cast as the heir to Joseph's righteousness and authority. Chroniclers picked up this theme and wove it into their prose. Ibn Wasil, for example, describes how, after the death of his young nephew, Saladin took command of the Syrian troops stationed in Cairo. At that point, he writes, Saladin gave up wine and entertainment and adopted a more serious, disciplined way of life. The emphasis here is not just on a change of office, but on a spiritual turning point. By framing Saladin's rise as a kind of repentance and renewal, authors could insert him into the sacred timeline of Islam, placing his victories alongside the great moments of the early community and the stories of prophets. When news reached Damascus that Saladin had crushed a revolt in Cairo in 1169, Imad al-Din sent him a panegyrical poem. In that piece, he called Saladin the Joseph of Egypt, the focus of everyone's hopes, and described Egypt's twin Nile branches as if one now ran red with the blood of enemies, while the other carried divine favor. He urged Saladin to move from victory in the Nile Valley to further goals, seizing the Mediterranean coast and purifying Jerusalem from foreign rule. In a second poem, written after the execution of the Fatimid vizier Shawar, Imad again drew on biblical and Quranic images, saying that the killing of Shawar by Yusuf could only be compared to David's defeat of Goliath. The message was simple. Saladin was the chosen champion who toppled the giants of heresy and unbelief. The figure of Pharaoh also played an important part in this ideological world. In the Quran, Pharaoh appears repeatedly as the arrogant ruler who defies God and leads his people to destruction. Later, Muslim writers made him the archetype of tyrannical evil. Doomed to hellfire, Saladin's biographers were well aware of this tradition and put it to work in their portrayal of his anti-Fatimid policies. In their telling, the Fatimid regime in Egypt took on a pharaonic character, while Saladin became the savior who liberated the Nile Valley from a corrupt and misguided court. A Yemeni poet named Umara, who was in Cairo when Saladin abolished the Fatimid Vizirate, put it in personal terms. He described himself as a believer living among the people of Pharaoh, clinging to his faith even with death close at hand. The implication was that Saladin had delivered such believers from a hostile environment. Other poets celebrated the reunion between Najm al-Din Ayyub and his sons in similar imagery. Abd al-Munim al-Jilyan wrote of Najm al-Din's star rising in the east and his sons appearing like blazing comets. He likened their journey from Syria to Egypt to Jacob traveling with his tribe to join Joseph. When father and sons met again in Egypt, he noted, there was no jealousy or betrayal this time. Unlike the earlier biblical story, the brothers stood united around their Joseph. The end of the Fatimid Caliphate provided another powerful moment to reinforce the Joseph theme. When the last Fatimid ruler, Al-Adid, died and the dynasty collapsed, Imad al-Dun composed a sharp-edged poem. He announced that the age of Pharaoh in Egypt was over and that no impostor would seize the country again. From now on, he wrote, the reins of power would rest in the hands of the Joseph of Egypt. In just a few lines, he turned a complex political transition into a neat biblical drama. The false king falls, Pharaoh's time ends, and the rightful Joseph takes the throne. Ibn Wasil offers an especially vivid summary of this whole analogy. He tells how Najm al-Din Ayyub came to Egypt and found his son, al-Malik al-Nasir Salah al-Din, already ruling the Nile Valley alongside the now powerless Fatimid Caliph. To capture the emotional weight of this meeting, he quotes Quranic verses from the story of Joseph. The moment when Joseph invites his parents to enter Egypt in safety. The scene where he raises them onto his throne and reminds his father that his youthful dream has finally come true. In Ibn Wasil's retelling, Ayyub's arrival in Egypt and reunion with his powerful son becomes a replay of Jacob's joyous recognition of Joseph. The comparison did not stop there. At other points, Saladin is likened to Job, whose patience in suffering is legendary, or to David lamenting defeat. When news reached him of the setback at Montgisard, some writers say he accepted it with the endurance of Job and grieved like the biblical king, giving his distress a scriptural frame. After the victory at Jacob's Ford in 1179, the poet Ibn al-Sa'atok again turned to the Joseph story. He described Saladin halting at the fortress, raising his yellow banner and terrifying his enemies. He accused the Franks of dishonesty in matters of faith and portrayed Saladin as having warned them, fulfilling a religious duty before striking. Then he wrote that the house of Jacob was scattered and Joseph stepped forward. Another way of saying that the Christians were overthrown and Saladin emerged as the true heir of the prophetic line. The triumph at Hattin in 1187 also drew Joseph parallels. Some authors likened the capture and later release of certain prisoners to Joseph's experience in Egypt. Imprisoned, then freed and honored beyond Muslim sources, Christian writers noticed the same language. The Syriac historian Bar Hebraeus, summarizing the shift from Fatimid to Ayyubid rule, reported that poets used to say, "Pharaoh's rule has ended and Joseph's has begun." This shows how far the Joseph-Saladin association had traveled. It was not only a Muslim rhetorical device, but also something outsiders had heard and recorded. The first Friday sermon delivered in the Aqsa Mosque after Saladin's conquest of Jerusalem added another layer of biblical memory. The preacher reminded his audience that this was the place where God had once stopped the sun for Joshua, allowing him to complete his victory, and where Moses had commanded his people to take possession of the land, only to have them refuse and be punished with years of wandering. The message was that earlier communities had failed their divine test, and now God had granted the guardianship of this sacred space to the Muslims instead. In that way, the sermon linked Saladin's victory to the whole chain of prophetic history. Even the story of Saladin's death was enveloped in this imagery. One of his admirers recounts a vision allegedly seen on the night he died. Someone heard a voice saying that Joseph has been released from his prison tonight. This line was then connected to a well-known saying that the world is like a prison for believers and a paradise for unbelievers. The implication was that Saladin, our Joseph, had spent his life in the confines of this world, and that his death was his true liberation, the final opening he had longed for, the gates of paradise now thrown wide. The official language of the Ayyubid court also drew on biblical and Quranic imagery. When Imad al-Din wrote to the Abbasid court in Baghdad about Saladin's victories in the summer of 1187, he opened his report with a verse from Scripture that speaks of the righteous inheriting the earth. By choosing that line, he signaled that the transfer of lands from Crusader to Sultan was not just a political fact, but a fulfillment of divine promise. It fit perfectly with the larger campaign to present Saladin as both a restorer of justice and a figure in the mold of the ancient prophets. This Joseph-like image of Saladin spread quickly across the Near East. It was strong enough that even some Latin observers felt compelled to respond to it. An anonymous Latin poem turns the comparison upside down, insisting that Saladin was no Joseph and should not have been called Joseph. It accuses him of rising to power through adultery and betrayal within the royal household, claiming that by this crime he gained a status almost equal to the king. The tone is hostile, but the very fact that the poet frames his attack around the Joseph theme shows how well known that association had become. Saladin's supporters had successfully turned a biblical story into a powerful political myth, and even his enemies were forced to argue against it on its own terms. When Abu Shama of Damascus opened his work, Kitab al-Rawdatain, devoted to the reigns of Nur al-Din and Saladin, he paused first to explain how deeply he had been moved by the material he was collecting and reading. Reflecting on their lives, he wrote that he saw these two rulers as the equals of the two great Umar figures of early Islam, Umar ibn al-Khattab and Umar ibn Abd al-Aziz, since both Nur al-Din and Saladin, in his eyes, followed those early models in justice, holy war, and tireless effort for the honor of God's religion. From this feeling grew his sense of obligation. He stated that it was a duty to preserve and broadcast their virtues, and he hoped that by recalling their example, later generations would be inspired to imitate them. Modern scholars have paid considerable attention to the Arabic writing of the Zangid and Ayyubid periods, and to the wider discourse of Muslim authors who lived through the Crusades. Much of this research asks how these writers understood the intentions of the Crusaders and how they framed the idea of resistance, and holy war studies of their language show just how religiously charged their writing was. Many authors bring in hadith that praise Syria, Palestine, and Jerusalem, stressing the special merits of these regions, or sayings that exalt jihad, and those who engage in it. Other scholars have underlined how these texts link personal piety with active participation in the defense of the lands of Islam, so that fighting and devotion appear as two sides of the same coin. To this picture, we can add another layer: the way medieval Muslim writers drew on stories from the earliest period of Islam and used them as a framework to interpret their own age, as Abu Shama himself clearly does. The importance of narratives about the past informing identities and making sense of current events is widely accepted in many fields. In the study of medieval Muslim historical writing, this idea has been particularly fruitful. Some researchers speak of a process of historicizing in which chroniclers place events they have witnessed into a long chain of continuity, or in some cases, present them as breaks with earlier patterns. The way an author chooses his comparisons, which stories he evokes and which he ignores, can reveal as much about his own time as about the era he describes. A later layer of analogy uses the crusading period itself as a reservoir of images and lessons for modern times. 20th century Arab historians, for instance, often compared the struggles of their ancestors against the Crusaders with modern battles against imperialism, colonial rule, and Zionism. From these comparisons, they sometimes drew hopeful conclusions. If the Crusades ended in failure for the invaders and in victory for the Muslim side, then the present confrontation with the West would eventually tip the same way. On the other side, some modern Hebrew historians and publicists have also invoked the Crusades, sometimes in surprising ways and with conflicting lessons. Saladin, in particular, has been endlessly reimagined, not only in medieval sources, but also in Ottoman, modern Arab, and Western historical, literary, and artistic works. To see how such analogies operated already in the 12th and 13th centuries, it is useful to turn to a less familiar work by the Damascene preacher and historian Sibt ibn al-Jawzi, who died in 1256. In his lifetime, he became famous for his weekly preaching sessions in Damascus, which drew large crowds, and later generations knew him above all as the author of a vivid chronicle known as Mirat al-Zaman, the Mirror of Time. In addition to that chronicle, he wrote a book of advice for rulers, a mirror for princes, dedicated to his patron and friend, the Ayyubid ruler al-Malik al-Ashraf. In that book, he included a long section on jihad, in which he first unpacks the different senses of the word. He explains that jihad can mean armed struggle on the battlefield, the struggle against one's inner passions, the fight against the devil, verbal polemic and refutation of heretics and dissidents, and the strenuous effort of the mystic who strives to purify the heart and cut off all distractions from God. In line with a well-known prophetic saying, he places the inner struggle of the heart above physical fighting, echoing the idea that the return from the battlefield marks a passage from the lesser jihad to the greater jihad. Only after defining these layers of meaning does Sibt ibn al-Jawzi move on to a series of stories about warriors from three historical phases. First come the companions of the Prophet who fought against Quraysh, then the soldiers who took part in the conquest of Syria in the time of Umar ibn al-Khattab, and finally the volunteers who for generations manned the frontier with Byzantium in the 8th to 10th centuries. Following his pattern, we can also treat these three clusters of memory as three main strands of reference in later crusading era writing. By the time of the Crusades, the stories and myths about the founding period of Islam had been worked out and elaborated over at least 4 centuries. The first four caliphs had long since been set apart as the rightly guided caliphs by what became the Sunni mainstream. The companions of the Prophet were praised in countless texts, with entire chapters in hadith collections devoted to their virtues and their service to Islam. Historians of the 3rd and 4th Islamic centuries helped fix their elevated status in doctrine and public imagination. As Thomas Sisgerich has convincingly argued, the figure of the devout fighter, ascetic yet martial, described in the famous phrase as a horseman by day and a monk by night, was woven into the foundational narrative. A grand story in which God grants the Muslim community control over vast lands and immense wealth. Sibt ibn al-Jawzi begins his stories of the warriors of old with anecdotes about the men of Badr, the first major clash between the Prophet's followers and their opponents from Mecca. This battle, which took place 2 years after the migration to Medina and ended in a striking Muslim victory, quickly became a central symbol of divine support. In his retelling, Sibt ibn al-Jawzi singles out those fighters who openly longed for martyrdom and achieved it. The youth who insisted on joining despite his age, the elderly and lame man whose sons tried in vain to keep him at home, the fighter who lost an arm at Badr but nevertheless went out again in the next campaign. The memory of Badr remained powerful. The poet Ibn al-Qaisarani, who died in the mid-12th century and had fled the coastal city of Caesarea for Mosul, drew on it in a panegyric for Zangi after the capture of Edessa in 1144. He describes angels accompanying Zangi's troops, echoing the Quranic imagery of angels encouraging the believers at Badr. When Saladin took Jerusalem in 1187, many of his contemporaries framed this moment as a new Badr. The preacher Ibn al-Zaki, who secured the prestigious honor of delivering the first Friday sermon in the reconsecrated Aqsa Mosque after the handover, was one of the first to make this comparison. Even lesser victories could be drawn into this field of associations. In 1179, Saladin defeated a Frankish force in the region of Marj Ayun in southern Lebanon. Poet Abu Ali al-Hasan al-Iraqi al-Juwayni likened this encounter to the Battle of Hunain, fought by the Prophet's forces against the tribes of Hawazin not long after the conquest of Mecca. At Hunain, the Muslims had initially faltered and seemed close to collapse, only to rally and transform near defeat into triumph and rich spoils. At Marj Ayun, Saladin and his men were similarly surprised and pressed hard by a large Frankish army led by King Baldwin IV, yet recovered and managed to capture hundreds of knights, including the heads of the Templars and Hospitallers, who were then exchanged for large ransoms and many Muslim prisoners. Sometimes the analogy ran in a negative direction, highlighting Muslim leaders who failed to live up to those early standards. After Nur al-Din seized Damascus in 1154, one poet criticized the ousted ruler Mujir al-Din, who preferred agreements with the Crusaders to fighting them. He compared the Damascus elite to the Jews of Khaybar, who, in the tradition, cooperated with Quraysh against the Prophet. His punchline was blunt. Whoever defends the fortress of Islam is a believer. Whoever fails to do so is an unbeliever. The boldest uses of such comparisons appear in the work of Imad al-Din al-Isfahani, Saladin's chief secretary. He suggested that Saladin's capture of Jerusalem on the 27th of Rajab, in the year 583 of the Hijra, should be placed alongside the Prophet's night journey to Jerusalem, which tradition also dates to that same night. When he began his history of the reconquest of the city, he claimed that while histories often start with the creation of humanity or with the rise of dynasties, his narrative would begin with a second migration, the migration of Islam to Jerusalem under Saladin. He declared that history might well be dated from this year, and even hinted that this second migration had a more enduring impact than the first. In a report to the Abbasid Caliph, Imad al-Din made another daring comparison, this time drawing from a Quranic verse that speaks of God's favor being granted twice. He wrote that the first such favor had been in the time of the Prophet and his companions, while the second was in his own day, when Islam had been freed from humiliation and misfortune. The implication was that Saladin's victories formed a second great turning point in sacred history. Abu Shama preserves an even more intimate piece of symbolism. During his final illness, far from home, Saladin is said to have remarked that if he died, he had already chosen Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali as his successors. He was referring not to the original caliphs, but to his brother al-Adil Abu Bakr, his nephew Taqi al-Din Umar, and his two sons al-Aziz Uthman and al-Afdal Ali. By mentioning only the parts of their names that matched the names of the first four caliphs, he aligned his own familial circle with the foundational sequence of Sunni leadership. The statement can be read both as an assertion of continuity with early Islam and as a declaration of loyalty to Sunni orthodoxy at a time when the struggle against the Crusaders was tightly linked to the restoration of Sunni dominance in Syria. The great Arab conquests that followed the Prophet's death, especially the rapid takeover of Syria in the 600s, also provided a constant stock of references. Ibn al-Zaki, in praising Saladin, listed the famous early battles of Al-Qadisiyah, Yarmouk, and Khaybar, and compared his achievements to the charges led by Khalid ibn al-Walid. The Andalusian emigrant poet and doctor Abu al-Fadl Abd al-Manam al-Jiliani exclaimed, in a poem on the recovery of Jerusalem, that it felt as if people were living again in the age of the Prophet's companions, and that Saladin deserved to be called al-Siddiq, the truthful, a title associated with Abu Bakr. Imad al-Din wrote that no victory of the kind seen in Jerusalem had occurred since the days of the companions, and he described Nur al-Din's consultation with scholars in Damascus about the use of endowment funds for fortifications as a revival of the old practice in which the companions gathered to deliberate on what best served the community. In one poem, Al-Arkhala compared Nur al-Din's gains to the conquests of Umar al-Faruq in east and west, in valleys and mountains. After Zangi's successful capture of the fortress of Barin in 1137, Ibn al-Qaisarani expressed the hope that all frontier strongholds would once again return to Muslim hands as joyfully as if they had been liberated by Umar himself. Because Umar ibn al-Khattab had personally received the surrender of Jerusalem in the 7th century. At least according to classical Muslim historians, his figure was repeatedly invoked when Saladin entered the city in 1187. The Egyptian poet Muhammad ibn Asad al-Juwayni addressed Saladin as the Faruq of Jerusalem and as Umar, the pure leader. Ibn Shaddad, reflecting on one of Saladin's shrewd assessments of the military situation in 1190, commented that his judgment fit the prophetic saying that there are inspired people in the community and that Umar is one of them. Even Ibn al-Athir, who often favored the memory of the Zangids over the Ayyubids, conceded that no one since Umar had achieved what Saladin did in retaking Jerusalem, and that this alone sufficed for his fame and honor. Comparisons to the two Umars as a pair span beyond warfare. In praising Nur al-Din, Ibn al-Athir writes that Since the time of the rightly guided caliphs and Umar ibn Abd al-Aziz, he had not seen a ruler whose conduct surpassed Nur al-Din's in justice and fairness. He portrays him as a man who devoted all his days and nights to spreading justice and made that concern his personal jihad. Other biographers emphasize the same trait, and contemporary inscriptions carved on his buildings praise his justice as part of his official title. Some scholars argue that this image of Nur al-Din as an exemplar of justice dominates most 12th and 13th century accounts of his reign, while the image of him primarily as a warrior of jihad is a particular emphasis of Ibn al-Athir. In a similar way, the first part of Ibn Shaddad's biography of Saladin, which catalogues his virtues of fairness, generosity, courage, steadfastness, compassion, and resolve, seems designed to draw a line between his life and the conduct of the Prophet. Early accounts contrast the humility and humanity of Umar with the bloody brutality of the Crusaders when they seized Jerusalem in 1099. Umar is said to have entered the city on foot, dressed simply, and to have guaranteed the safety and property of its inhabitants. He refused to perform his prayer inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, so that later generations would not claim the site for Islam and thereby push out the Christians. Instead, he prayed outside. When Saladin entered Jerusalem, some of his emirs urged him to tear down the church so as to deny the Christians the main focus of their pilgrimage. Others argued that Christian devotion in fact centered on the place of crucifixion itself, so demolishing the building might not prevent future claims. Still others reminded Saladin that Umar, when he took the city, had left the church standing and confirmed the Christian right to worship there. This last point played a decisive role in persuading Saladin to spare the church. Older traditions, repeated by geographers and by authors who collected the virtues of Jerusalem, told how Umar had visited the prayer place of David when he entered the city and recited the Quranic chapter that mentions David's prayer niche, thereby linking the text, the figure of the prophet king, and the location itself. When Saladin recovered the city, he renewed that connection by restoring the site, appointing an imam and muezzins, and providing it with attendants. Umar ibn Abd al-Aziz, the Umayyad Caliph celebrated for his piety and self-restraint, also served as a model in these analogies. When Nur al-Din is praised for his indifference to flattering poetry, for example, writers remark that this was also the habit of Umar ibn Abd al-Aziz, the most ascetic of caliphs, nor was this pattern of comparison confined to sultans and princes. Devout volunteers who took part in the struggle against the Crusaders were often likened to the companions who had joined the early conquests for purely religious reasons. As early as 1105, only a few years after the first Crusaders arrived, the preacher Ali ibn Tahir al-Sulami delivered sermons in Damascus in which he recalled how the companions were ready to give their lives for the conquest of Syria. Several decades later, the great historian Ibn Asakir, in his biographical history of Damascus, described the people of Syria as defenders in the path of God and as the army of God, simply by virtue of where they lived. Usama ibn Munkidh, the famous Syrian aristocrat and writer, praised two elderly scholars who left Damascus during the siege of the Second Crusade to seek martyrdom in attacks on the enemy, and compared them to the earliest fighters of Islam, stressing their pure intentions. In a further echo of this pattern, both Imad al-Din and Ibn Wasil, describing a battle near Acre in 1189, singled out one fallen soldier as the worthy descendant of his ancestor Ibn Rawaha, who had died at Mu'tah fighting the Byzantines many centuries earlier. They summed up the parallel by saying that one man had fallen as a martyr at Mata facing the Romans, and the other had fallen as a martyr on the plain of Acre facing the Franks. The memory of those early frontier warriors was still alive in crusading times, and not only in passing references. During the Second Crusade, in Damascus, a treatise on jihad composed by one of those frontier figures was read publicly. This work, by Abd Allah ibn al-Mubarak, is a collection of sayings about the merits of jihad and martyrdom, and is probably the earliest surviving compilation of its kind. Ibn al-Mubarak, who died in 797, became a model of the fighting scholar on the Arab-Byzantine frontier. Known for his strict asceticism and his courage both in battle against Christians and in his moral confrontations with Muslim rulers, his life and that of his comrades were soon taken up in hagiographical writings, which highlighted their dedication to holy war, their renunciation of worldly comforts, and the inner tensions of such an extreme way of life. By the time of the Crusades, these older stories gave Muslim preachers and writers a rich gallery of heroes to invoke as they urged their contemporaries to fight and to see themselves as part of a long chain of struggle and faith. In the early 12th century, ideas about holy war were not only debated in books, they were performed in mosques in front of ordinary believers. One of the most striking examples comes from Ali ibn Tahir al-Sulami's work on jihad, which was read aloud in a village mosque just outside Damascus around 1105. In that setting, he retold the story of Sa'id ibn al-Harith, who had fought against the Byzantines in the early 8th century. According to the tale, Sa'id went into battle fired by a powerful vision. In his dream, he had seen the woman who would be his eternal companion in paradise, and she had promised that she was destined for him once he died as a martyr. Strengthened by this promise, he fought fiercely for 3 days until he was fatally wounded. Al-Sulami, however, is careful to warn his listeners that true jihad must be undertaken out of devotion to God, not simply out of a desire for heavenly pleasures. The way he tells it makes clear that, in his view, Sa'id's courage grew from piety first, reward only second. Sibt ibn al-Jawzi, the great preacher and historian of Damascus, drew constantly on that older frontier tradition in his sermons and writings. He liked to share stories from the long war zone between the Muslim world and Byzantium, and to use them as moral examples. One of his favorite narratives tells of a devout man who spent 1 year traveling to Mecca and the next year serving on the frontier, alternating pilgrimage and battlefield for a lifetime. In one campaign, this man found himself locked in single combat with a Byzantine soldier. When the time for prayer arrived, he asked his opponent to let him pause for worship and then resume the duel. The Byzantine fighter agreed and kept his word. Later, when the Christian's own prayer time came, the Muslim promised to do the same. But as his enemy turned away, the temptation arose. Should he strike from behind and end the fight? At that moment, a heavenly voice reminded him of a verse from the Quran. His hand trembled, the sword slipped from his grasp, and he could not bring himself to betray the promise. Astonished that even the enemy of the Christians was protected by this divine sense of justice, the Byzantine soldier declared the Muslim testimony of faith on the spot and converted. In another story Sibt retells elsewhere, he uses the example of Ibn Qudama, a veteran of the 9th century frontier who witnessed a young man's deliberate quest for martyrdom and a mother's willing acceptance of his death as a sacrifice. Even if medieval writers do not always make the comparison explicit, they clearly model their portraits of crusading-era scholars and ascetics on these earlier frontier figures. A good example is the way they describe Abu Umar ibn Qudama, who died in 1210. He came from the village of Jama'il in Palestine and rose to become a magnetic religious leader in the Hanbali quarter on Mount Qasyun, overlooking Damascus. Biographers say that he never heard talk of a campaign without joining it, volunteering again and again for expeditions against the Franks. At the same time, he lived as a strict ascetic, obsessively avoiding forbidden food and luxuries, and devoting himself to long hours of prayer. On military service, he always offered to take the night watch while others slept, spending those hours in recitation and worship. Although his family had good relations with the rulers of Damascus, Abu Umar refused to cultivate political ties. Here, the parallels with the earlier frontier saint warrior Abd Allah ibn al-Mubarak are deliberate. When Saladin's brother and successor al-Malik al-Adil came personally to visit Abu Umar, the sheikh stayed in his tent, absorbed in prayer, and did not interrupt his devotions to greet the sultan. According to the story, the ruler waited under the hot sun, eventually gave up and left, while Abu Umar continued as if nothing had happened. Like the frontier heroes before him, he was also known for openly wishing for martyrdom in battle and for longing to die in the path of God. Shifting now from the world of preachers and frontier warriors to the politics of the Eastern Mediterranean, we find another long, interconnected story: the relationship between Latin-ruled Cyprus and the Mamluk Sultanate. From the late 12th century onward, the island was ruled by the French Lusignan dynasty, then later by Venice, while the Mamluks controlled Egypt and Syria until their own defeat by the Ottomans in the early 16th century. Between these two powers, there were centuries of contact, sometimes violent, sometimes diplomatic, and often driven by trade. Warfare, truces, commercial rivalry, religious tension, and even migration were all woven together. A shift in one area usually caused changes in the others. Open conflict between Cyprus and the Mamluks came in waves from the mid-13th century until the 1420s. After a major defeat in 1426, when King Janus of Cyprus was captured at the Battle of Kirokitia, the Lusignan kingdom was forced to accept the authority of the Mamluk sultans and to pay tribute, effectively placing the island under Mamluk overlordship. But long before that outcome, Cypriot rulers had already played a visible part in the defense of the last Latin enclaves on the mainland. As early as 1252, King Henry I of Cyprus sailed with a sizable force to the Syrian coast to support Louis IX in reinforcing the remaining Crusader strongholds. That effort could not stop the Mamluk advance. Under Sultan Baybars, beginning in the 1260s, the Mamluks steadily dismantled the remaining Latin positions. Acre came under attack, Arsuf and Caesarea fell, Haifa was destroyed, and the formidable inland fortress of Safed was captured. In response, Hugh III of Cyprus shipped troops from the island to shore up the defenses of Acre and other enclaves, sending several hundred knights and mounted squires in successive years. Despite these efforts, Baybars still managed to seize Jaffa, Beaufort, and Antioch in 1268, and later the great hospitaller castle of Krak de Chevaliers in 1271. Cyprus's role as a staging point and supply base did not escape Mamluk attention. To distract Hugh III from supporting the mainland, Baybars planned a surprise naval strike on Limassol. His galleys were painted black and marked with crosses to imitate Christian ships and secure surprise. The plan, however, ended in disaster when the fleet ran aground on the shallow coast. Many sailors and soldiers were captured and sent to Acre for ransom, though some later escaped. Mamluk chroniclers would later interpret the failure as divine punishment for painting crosses on Muslim ships as a form of deception, while other writers simply blamed poor coordination between rival admirals. Either way, the setback at Limassol did not reverse the wider tide. Baybars' successors continued the campaign. Caliban, taking advantage of disputes among the Latins, stormed Tripoli in 1289, despite Cypriot reinforcements led by King Henry II's brother, Amaury. 2 years later, Caliban's son and heir completed the work by capturing Acre. Henry II himself arrived with a contingent of knights and infantry, but his presence could not prevent the fall. Once Acre had gone, other coastal cities like Tyre and Sidon surrendered or were abandoned, and the surviving Templar garrisons fled to Cyprus. The lesson was bitterly clear. The resources of Cyprus alone, without substantial help from Western Europe, could not save the Latin states on the mainland. After the loss of Acre, Cypriot, and Crusader, strategy shifted. From 1291 to the early years of the 14th century, the island became the main base for naval campaigns against the Mamluk coasts. The military orders, the Templars and Hospitallers, moved their headquarters to Limassol and began building fleets of their own. Joint armadas of Cypriot ships and galleys of the orders launched raids on ports in Egypt and Syria. Some of these attacks were little more than large-scale raids. Others had more ambitious goals, such as recapturing coastal towns or islands. In 1292, a combined force from Cyprus and other Latin powers struck first at Adalia on the southern coast of Asia Minor, and then sailed on to attack Alexandria, Egypt's principal harbor. In 1300, another joint expedition of Lusignan, Templar, and Hospitaller ships hit targets along the Syrian and Egyptian shores. At the same time, the kings of Cyprus tried to build a grand alliance with the Mongol rulers of Persia, who were the Mamluks' rivals to the east. In theory, a coordinated campaign between Mongols advancing from inland and Latins attacking from the sea might have crushed Mamluk power. In practice, however, timing and aims never matched. The Mongols preferred swift raids over the conquest and occupation of Syrian cities, while the Latins dreamt of restoring their lost territories. In 1299, the Mongols entered Syria and invited the Templars, Hospitallers, and Cypriots to join them. The response was slow and disjointed. Amaury, acting for King Henry, did launch operations with the military orders and captured the small island of Ruad off Tortosa with a force of 300 Cypriot knights, the largest Lusignan field army ever assembled. He then occupied Tortosa itself, waiting for his eastern allies. The Mongols finally appeared, only to withdraw again after a short stay. The Latin troops returned to Cyprus. A second Mongol incursion in 1301 drove the Mamluks back as far as Homs, but again ended in withdrawal. Ruad, held as a forward outpost, was recaptured by a strong Mamluk fleet in 1302. More than 500 Templars died or were enslaved, and neither the Cypriot fleet nor the ships of the orders were able to relieve them. Later attempts by the Hospitallers to channel their energy into campaigns in Cilician Armenia likewise failed to produce decisive blows against the Mamluks. These frustrations formed part of the background to an internal crisis on the island. When Amaury led a coup against his brother Henry II in 1306, he justified his actions by accusing Henry of neglecting Cyprus's defenses, limiting the landholdings and income of the military orders because he feared their power, and failing to pursue serious action against the Mamluks. When Henry regained his throne in 1310 with Hospitaller help, he tried to reposition Cyprus as the natural base for any future crusade. To the Pope, He presented detailed plans before the Council of Vienne. Cyprus, he argued, could serve both as a springboard for attacks on Egypt and Syria, and as the center of a naval blockade that would weaken the Mamluks economically before an invasion. Its location, so close to both coasts, meant that the Mamluks would be forced to divide their forces, never knowing where the next blow would fall. These proposals, however, remained on paper. As Turkish principalities, and above all, the Ottomans expanded across Asia Minor in the 14th century, international crusading priorities shifted toward the Aegean and Western Anatolia. The Turks came to be seen as the main threat. Instead of grand plans to retake Jerusalem, European powers preferred to organize naval leagues aimed at curbing Turkish piracy. Even so, Cyprus did not completely abandon conflict with the Mamluks. Under King Peter I, who ruled in the 1360s, the kingdom once again took the offensive, this time with a spectacular attack on Alexandria. The port had become Famagusta's major rival as a commercial center after the loss of the Armenian harbor of Lahatso. Some historians argue that Peter's decision was driven as much by economic competition as by religious zeal. Since the papal ban on trade with Muslim lands had been relaxed in the mid-14th century, merchants had increasingly shifted their business to Alexandria, undermining the prosperity of Cyprus. Whatever the king's motives, a desire for crusading glory, commercial advantage, or both, the raid yielded short-term fame in the West, but long-term disaster at home. The war with the Mamluks drained Cypriot finances and contributed to domestic unrest. In 1369, Peter was assassinated by nobles angered by the costs and risks of his aggressive policies. Meanwhile, Italian powers were furious that Alexandria, a key trading partner, had been sacked. Genoa, in particular, took revenge. In 1373, its fleet invaded Cyprus, captured Famagusta, and kept it for nearly a century. Under the peace agreement a decade later, Cyprus was forced to pay Genoa a heavy annual indemnity, which placed the kingdom under constant financial strain. That economic pressure pushed Cyprus into a different, darker kind of warfare in the early 15th century: systematic piracy. Catalan, Cypriot, and Rhodian raiders, often with the knowledge and support of Cypriot nobles and even the king, used the island as a base to attack shipping and coastal settlements in Egypt and Syria. They seized Muslim vessels, took thousands of captives, and sold them in the slave markets of Rhodes and Cyprus. On the island, many of these prisoners were put to work on large sugar estates in the fertile lands around Colossi, Episcopi, and Lemba, owned by the Hospitallers, wealthy Venetian families, and the crown. Unsurprisingly, the Mamluks retaliated. In 1410 and 1411, their forces raided the coasts of Cyprus and the Genoese-held port of Famagusta, despite earlier attempts by the Genoese to appease Cairo by ransoming Muslim captives. Alarmed by the prospect of further retaliation, the Cypriot king agreed to a peace with the Mamluk Sultan. He promised not to allow pirates operating from the island to attack Syria, not to provision them if they put into Cypriot ports, and not to let his own subjects buy or trade in stolen goods. It was a reluctant recognition that the island's fortunes were now tightly bound to the power across the water, and that reckless raids could invite ruin as easily as reward. In the early 15th century, the political elite of Cyprus began to pull in a very different direction from both their king and the Western merchants living on the island. While Janus and the traders wanted calm seas and predictable commerce, many nobles saw far more profit in piracy and in filling their estates with enslaved laborers. In 1413, Janus's own brother, Prince Henry of Galilee, joined forces with a group of Catalan raiders and struck the Syrian coast, seizing so many Muslim captives that the governor of Damascus had to send an embassy with money just to ransom them. A new peace agreement signed the next year between the Cypriot crown and the Mamluk Sultan existed only on paper. It clashed directly with the interests of the nobility, who were getting rich from piracy and using captives as workers on their lands. Very quickly, even the king gave in to the logic of this system. By 1415, with royal revenues shrinking and his sugar plantations short of labor, Janus ordered the royal war galley to attack the Egyptian coast. About 1,500 people were seized in that operation and carried back to Cyprus. When the Mamluk ruler Al-Mu'ayyad demanded their release in anger, Janus bluntly answered that they were needed to work in the sugar fields, even though some captives taken in Cypriot raids were in fact ransomed that same year. Meanwhile, Catalan pirates continued to use Cypriot ports as safe harbors, buying supplies and selling their plunder there. Not long after 1422, a Muslim captive managed to escape from the island and told the Sultan that senior officials in Cyprus were directly backing the pirates, even naming Philip de Piquigny, the royal bailiff of Limassol, as one of their main protectors. Around the same time, the Beirut chronicler Salih ibn Yahya recorded how a ship carrying soap and goods for a prominent merchant under the Sultan's protection was seized by Basque raiders and taken to Cyprus stories. Like these hardened the Mamluk leadership's determination to punish the island. Retribution followed. In the summer of 1424, a Mamluk naval force met the Lusignan fleet off Limassol and won, marking the first clear sea victory by the Sultanate. After defeating the Cypriot ships, they plundered Limassol's fortress and several coastal villages. Janus himself had refused a peace offer from the governor of Syria and other Mamluk commanders, even though he personally leaned toward accepting it. His brother Henry and a circle of hardline counselors, whose fortunes were tied to piracy, pushed him into continuing confrontation. A second punitive raid came soon after, and the third expedition in 1426 delivered the decisive blow. Janus was defeated and captured at the Battle of Kirokitia, and the capital, Nicosia, was looted by Mamluk troops. Ironically, these successes came at a time when the Mamluk fleet was in poor condition. Shipbuilding at Beirut's arsenal had been neglected for years. Observers like the Venetian Emanuel Pilotti remarked that some galleys were so badly equipped they did not even have enough rudders to move soldiers across the sea. The Mamluks relied on river transports normally used on the Nile and on merchant ships requisitioned from European traders in Egypt. That weakness helps explain why, before 1424, Catalan, Rhodian, and Cypriot raiders had been able to strike Egyptian and Syrian shores repeatedly with little fear of being intercepted. Not everyone in Cyprus welcomed this cycle of war and reprisal. A group known as the White Venetians, people in the East who held Venetian citizenship and were heavily involved in trade, had every reason to resent noble-led piracy, which threatened their business. When Mamluk troops approached Nicosia in 1426, these merchants reportedly opened the city's gates and even led the invaders straight to the royal treasury. Their actions look very much like personal revenge on a crown and nobility whose private wars had damaged their commercial interests. Even the great defeat of 1426 did not completely stamp out piracy. The difference was that much of it now operated from outside the formal borders of the Lusignan kingdom, Genoese-held Famagusta, which lay beyond direct royal control, became a convenient base for Catalan and Biscayan pirates. With the help of corrupt Genoese officials, they continued to raid Mamluk shipping and coastal towns well into the later 15th century. Still, after Janus's capture and Cyprus's reduction to a tributary state under Mamluk suzerainty, large-scale war and open campaigns against Egypt and Syria ceased to dominate the relationship. Tribute and diplomacy took center stage. Throughout this long history of conflict, formal contacts never stopped. War and negotiation were tightly intertwined, and embassies traveled back and forth across the eastern Mediterranean even at tense moments. Much of what we know about these missions comes from Cypriot chronicles and Mamluk narratives. Since the official archives of both realms have largely disappeared, envoys could be great lords or senior emirs, but also merchants, notaries, and in some cases converts, whose knowledge of both languages and cultures made them invaluable intermediaries. Their journeys could end in honor or in chains. In 1289, Henry II of Cyprus and Sultan al-Qalawun agreed on a truce with a symbolic duration of 10 years, 10 months, and 10 days. But a violent incident in Acre in 1290, when Western newcomers attacked Muslim peasants heading to market, gave the Mamluks exactly the excuse they needed to resume hostilities. Shortly before Acre fell in 1291, the city sent a small embassy of 4 men to the new sultan, al-Ashraf. All were thrown into prison. Their leader, Philip Mainboef, a native speaker of Arabic and a man of the land, remained in captivity until 1319, a stark reminder of how dangerous diplomatic service could be. Later wars, such as the conflict of 1366 to 1370 sparked by Peter I's Alexandrian Crusade, triggered a flurry of missions as different actors, the King of Cyprus, Venice, Genoa, tried to patch up relations with Cairo. Among the envoys were high-ranking knights like James de Norres and Hugh de la Baume, learned officials such as the jurist known as Anthony, and merchants like Cassan Sigala and Nicholas Justiniani. On one occasion, Janus's predecessors even resorted to sending 2 Muslim slaves with royal letters, fearful that Christian envoys might again be detained. Earlier still, in 1366, one of the messengers sent from Cyprus to Egypt was John d'Alfonso, a Catalan who had converted from Judaism to Christianity and who could move more easily between both worlds. On the Mamluk side, envoys were often senior emirs, sometimes accompanied by sizable retinues. Early in 1370, the Sultan even repurposed 4 Christian prisoners, 2 Venetians and 2 Genoese merchants, as ambassadors, sending them to negotiate peace with Prince John of Antioch, who was acting as regent after Peter I's murder. On the eve of the 1426 invasion, a respected religious notable, the son of a famous Damascene sheikh, was dispatched to Cyprus to plead with Janus to rein in the pirates. He was denied an audience and sent away with nothing. During the invasion itself, the Mamluks tried again, this time using an elderly soldier who had converted from Christianity as their messenger, hoping his background would open doors. He too was refused access. The only Mamluk envoy who actually reached the king that summer was a simple peasant carrying a letter. He was tortured so viciously that he died, and when Mamluk soldiers found his body, they unleashed their anger in the fighting at Kirokitia. Once Cyprus was formally reduced to tributary status, the exchange of embassies did not end. It simply took on a different tone. Mamluk delegations arrived regularly to collect the annual payments and to reaffirm the hierarchy between Cairo and Nicosia. For the Cypriot court, these visits were expensive. Lavish hospitality had to be provided, and every embassy drained the royal purse a little more. Cypriot rulers also sent their own representatives to Egypt, and not all of them were islanders. In 1437, the Castilian noble Pero Tafur traveled to Cairo on behalf of King John II. He took with him 3 requests: that fewer Mamluks be sent to Cyprus to collect the tribute, since entertaining them cost a fortune; that the textiles and other goods sent as payment in kind should be valued according to Egyptian, not Cypriot, market prices; and that Cypriot salt be allowed to circulate duty-free throughout Mamluk lands. All 3 demands, he later claimed, were granted. As a visible sign of favor and vassalage, the Sultan presented him with an ornate robe. A gesture already traditional by the 13th century Tafur did not end up in this role by accident. He was a close friend of Carceran Suarez, a fellow Castilian who had become Admiral of Cyprus after saving Janus's life at Kirokitia. On arrival in Cairo, Tafur was also assisted by Tagribirdi, the chief interpreter at the Mamluk court, himself a converted Jew from Seville. Tagribirdi was on excellent terms with the Lusignan house, receiving an annual pension from both Janus and John II, in gratitude for the help he had given the king during his captivity. Even with such connections, some promises made in these audiences did not always hold in the long term. A few years after Tafur's embassy, in 1450, Sultan Jakmak ordered one of his officers, Faris al-Turkmani, to sail to Cyprus, purchase Mongol slaves there, and send them back to Egypt, using both the gold he supplied and the tribute collected on the island. Delays in payment were another recurring problem. When Sultan Inal came to the throne in 1453, he received a letter from Peter Podokataro, a prominent noble and ambassador of King John II, describing the celebrations held in Cyprus to mark Inal's accession, a practice that echoed the public festivities organized in Mamluk cities after major victories or dynastic changes. Pleased by this display of loyalty, Inal wrote back in friendly terms, spoke well of King John to Mehmed II of the Ottomans in an effort to curb Turkish raids on Cyprus, and even cancelled accumulated tribute arrears amounting to 16,250 ducats. After John's death in 1458, however, Mamluk favor became a decisive factor in the succession struggle between his legitimate daughter, Queen Charlotte, and his illegitimate son, James. Both sides sent embassies to Cairo in 1459, traveling in the company of a Mamluk envoy who had originally been sent to proclaim Inal's support for James. There, James's representative, the astute friar William Gonim, outmaneuvered Charlotte's ambassador, Peter Podokataro, by promising to double the traditional tribute in a world where money and prestige were tightly linked. That offer tipped the scales. The Sultan endorsed James, and the tribute that symbolized Cyprus's dependence on Cairo became, in the end, a tool that decided who wore its crown. When civil war broke out in Cyprus between the factions of Queen Charlotte and her half-brother James, the struggle quickly drew in Cairo once again. After James seized Famagusta in 1464, he provoked a serious crisis with his Mamluk overlords. The Mamluk commander Janibeg and his garrison in the city had been kidnapping local boys, forcing them to convert to Islam and training them as new Mamluks. When Janibeg refused to obey James's order to stop these abductions, fighting erupted. James's men killed Janibeg and massacred many of his troops. That bloodshed made reconciliation with the Sultan essential. James had little choice but to send a fresh embassy to Egypt to calm the situation and explain himself. The man chosen for this dangerous task is described by the historian Ibn Tagribirdi as James the Frank. He returned to Cyprus accompanied by a Mamluk envoy named Sudun al-Mansuri, who, on going back to Cairo, reported in detail what he had seen and heard on the island. His mission looks very much like a political inspection after the killing of Janibeg's men. In the end, James managed to patch things up. Gifts were distributed not only to the Sultan, but also to influential figures at court, and Cairo once again accepted him as ruler of Cyprus. A few years later, in 1466, James also secured papal recognition as King James II. Because the Mamluk sultans claimed suzerainty over Cyprus, their formal approval was sought every time the throne changed hands. When James II died in 1473, two rival claimants immediately turned to Cairo. His sister, the exiled Queen Charlotte, and his Venetian widow, Catherine, both sent envoys to Sultan Qaitbay. The delegation representing Catherine, led by Andrea Casoli from Famagusta and Anthony de Lorsa, won the Sultan's ear. Charlotte's envoys were refused an audience, detained for a time, then handed over to Catherine's ambassadors, who sent them back to Rhodes, where Charlotte was living. Qaitbay also signaled his favor clearly. He told Catherine's men that 3 overdue tribute payments should be made, totaling 24,000 ducats, along with a handsome present in honor of the Queen's entry into her kingdom. In the years that followed, Venice quietly tightened its grip on Cyprus after James's death. Many of his old supporters, especially Catalans and Sicilians who opposed Venetian influence, fled the island. From that point, relations between Venice-controlled Cyprus and the Mamluk court passed through 2 distinct stages. First came the period when Catherine still reigned as queen, under Venetian guidance. Venice's main concern, then, was to secure Egyptian recognition of its effective control over Cyprus, and to prevent Qaitbay from backing other pretenders. The list of potential rivals was long. Queen Charlotte and her daughter Carla, King Ferdinand of Naples and his illegitimate son, Don Alonso, and James's 2 illegitimate sons, Eugene and John. The second stage began after Catherine abdicated in 1489, and Venetian rule became explicit rather than indirect. Cairo formally recognized this change in 1490. From then on, diplomatic exchanges focused mainly on the regular payment of tribute from Cyprus and on the quality of the textiles and camlets that formed part of that payment, which Mamluk officials sometimes criticized as inferior. A Venetian envoy from Cyprus, who reached Cairo in late 1474 or early 1475, was badly treated, probably because the Sultan suspected that King Ferdinand might try to seize the island. By the spring of 1476, however, the mood had shifted. When the Queen's next envoy, the Cypriot Thomas Ficard, arrived, the Sultan promised to send the first detained ambassador home, thanked Catherine for sending 2 years of back tribute, and rewarded her with costly gifts, including a gold brocade robe lined with ermine. This garment was both a sign of reconciliation and a reminder of vassal status. Venetian advisors even encouraged Catherine to sign her letters to the Sultan as "your slave," a formula that pleased Cairo while costing Venice nothing in real power. Even so, Qaitbay continued to hedge his bets for a time. He received Don Alonso and Queen Charlotte with courtesy when they came to Egypt in 1478 and sent his own envoy in the following years. But by then, the strategic picture had changed. Venice had warned Ferdinand not to send his fleet toward Cyprus, and he complied. In practice, Venetian control of the island was secure. Over the next decade, time worked steadily in Venice's favor. Carla died in 1480. Charlotte sold her claims to the Dukes of Savoy in 1485 and died 2 years later. Don Alonso left Egypt, And in 1488, the long-scheming Rizzo di Marino, an old partisan of King James who had plotted for years to overturn Venetian rule, was arrested and eventually executed. That same year, a second mission by Thomas Ficard to Cairo ended successfully. Although he was initially detained because tribute payments were late, he was released after promising that the arrears would be made good, given a robe of honor and rich gifts for Catherine, and allowed to return. In his report to Venice, he also stressed that the Sultan had refused to receive the Neapolitan ambassador, a telling sign of where Qaitbey's loyalties now lay. Relations did briefly sour again when news reached Cairo that Rizzo di Marino, who had previously represented the Mamluk Sultan on Rhodes, had been arrested by the Venetians. In anger, Qaitbey had the Venetian consul in Damietta thrown into prison and refused to see Marco Malipiero, the ambassador Venice sent in April 1489 to explain and justify its direct takeover of Cyprus. Venice responded by sending another envoy, Pietro Diedo, later that year. By March 1490, the Mamluk court had accepted Venetian rule over Cyprus as a fait accompli, a Catalan agent named Marcius, who had come to Cairo to complain about this change and tried to rally support through the court interpreter, was simply sent away. That interpreter, bearing the same name as an earlier court official, was a Spanish or Sicilian Jew who had first converted to Christianity and later to Islam. He was effectively on the Venetian payroll, which explains his eagerness to denounce Marcius and back Venice's case. The success of Venetian diplomacy over Cyprus must also be seen against a wider backdrop. Qaitbey was then locked in a bitter struggle with the expanding Ottoman Empire and was keen to build a common front with Western powers. In 1490, he concluded treaties with Venice and Florence and sent his own envoy to a papal assembly in Rome designed to organize a crusade against the Ottomans, though that plan never came to fruition. The physical closeness of Cyprus to Egypt and Syria meant that political and military ties were accompanied by rich cultural exchanges. These unfolded despite the confessional divide between a Latin Christian kingdom with a Greek majority and many Eastern Christian communities on one side, and a Sunni Muslim sultanate with its own Christian minorities on the other Christians of Eastern rites, especially Maronites and Melkites, played an important part in these contacts. But they were not the only intermediaries. Hunting provides one of the earliest and most vivid examples. Among the Latin nobility of Cyprus, and eventually among other groups as well, hunting was a passion King Hugh IV was particularly fond of it. An anonymous English traveler who visited the island in the 1340s records that the king used leopards to hunt wild sheep, which in reality were almost certainly cheetahs. A German traveler, Ludolf of Suschen, heard similar stories about John of Ibelin, Count of Jaffa, who owned hunting cats but had to sell them in the early 1340s. These animals were almost surely imported from Egypt, the closest African land, and a region famous for its wildlife, both native and brought up from Nubia and beyond. In the Islamic courts of the Eastern Mediterranean, cheetahs were well known and carefully distinguished from true leopards. In Mamluk Egypt, they were common enough to be kept in Cairo's menageries, and elite hunters used them for chasing game. They rode with princes and sultans, perched on saddles in hunts and parades alike. Arabic itself had deep roots on the island well before Mamluk power rose. Maronite communities, who spoke Arabic and gradually aligned with Rome during the 12th century, settled in Cyprus in growing numbers after the establishment of Lusignan rule. Arabic scribes were among those whom Guy de Lusignan encouraged to move to the island as he built up his new realm. By the 13th century, the language had developed its own local flavor. A scholar named Ibrahim as-Suwaidi compiled a work on plant names in which he carefully recorded regional variations. He treated the vocabulary used in Egypt, Palestine, and Cyprus as distinct sets, which shows that a recognizable Cypriot Arabic dialect already existed by his time. The influx of Eastern Christians between 1260 and 1291, driven from their homes by the Mamluk reconquest of Syria and Palestine, spread this dialect further. Arabic was not confined to villages or immigrant communities. Some of the highest-ranking noblewomen and kings could speak it, and sometimes swore in it. Isabella de Ibelin, who married King Hugh III in the mid-13th century, was known for her colorful oaths in Arabic, a habit her daughters Maria and Helvis also picked up. Hugh IV and his second wife, Alice de Ibelin, were said to know the language well enough to host Arab visitors from Egypt simply for lively conversation. Later, King Janus de Lusignan's knowledge of Arabic proved very useful when he was carried off to Cairo after his defeat and capture. In 1426, a Cypriot chronicler, sympathetic to the king, even claims that during his captivity, Janus mingled freely with young Mamluk recruits and sought out entertainment in the city. Behavior made possible by his ease in their language, Arabic speakers also shaped events on the island. When Mamluk forces reached the outskirts of Nicosia after Kirokitia, they hesitated outside the walls. At that moment, several knights who knew Arabic, most of Syrian origin, stepped forward. Men named Joseph, Bekna, Raymond Audeth, Sir Kimi and his brothers, and Sir Baden Gonem helped conduct the troops into the city and used their access to press for offices and favors under the new order. Their bilingualism became a political tool. As Famagusta grew into a major trading hub from the late 13th century onward, its population became ever more diverse. Arabic-speaking Eastern Christians played a prominent role in commerce and maintained close ties with co-religionists in Mamluk lands. This environment produced a class of interpreters and notaries known locally as drogomani or turchimani, who specialized in translating contracts and other documents between Arabic and Western languages. These figures came from many backgrounds: Latin priests, Melkite clergy, Eastern Christian scholars, and even the anonymous author of the so-called Templar of Tyre narrative, who worked as an Arabic translator in the Templar chancery. Travelers like the Augustinian James of Verona and the Greek merchant Athanasios Lependrenos remarked in the mid-14th century that many Cypriots could follow both Arabic and Latin-based tongues. A later chronicle by George Bustronios hints at an Arabic school in Nicosia in the 15th century, and there is direct evidence that Arabic literacy reached into the countryside. A land donation made in 1499 to the Church of St. George in the village of Kithrea was witnessed by a man named Isaac, who signed his name in Arabic script. Medical knowledge was another field in which Arabic culture left a clear mark. Physicians on the island admired the advanced medicine of the Islamic world and sometimes traveled there for treatment. In the mid-15th century, an Italian doctor known as Legno di Bologna, a respected physician and member of the municipal council in Genoese Famagusta, took 4 months' leave to go to Damascus. He had been losing his sight for 2 years and had found no cure in Cyprus. In Syria, under specialists trained in Arabic medical traditions, his vision was restored, and he returned home cured. Already in the 14th century, royal doctors collected translations of Arabic treatises. The library of Guy de Bagnolo, physician to King Peter I, included many such works. When his books were moved from Cyprus to Venice in the late 1360s, the translations went with them. The demand did not fade with time. In the 15th century, the noble James Singlitico acquired a medical manuscript copied around 1300 by the Greek scribe Michael Lulaudes. Its margins are full of notes that show doctors familiar with Arabic terminology were actively consulting it. When a technical term had no straightforward Greek equivalent, they simply wrote it out in Greek letters as they heard it in Arabic. Understanding these texts better gave doctors a strong incentive to learn Arabic themselves. Even after Venice formally annexed Cyprus, this link with Arabic scholarship remained important. In 1539, the powerful Council of Ten in Venice wrote to the island's authorities with a very specific request. They urged them to find a Coptic Christian who spoke Arabic well and to pay him to teach the language to other Copts, and any interested students. Their aim was practical. In a Coptic monastery dedicated to Saint Macarius in the mountains north of Nicosia, they had discovered books of medicine written in Arabic. To unlock their contents, they needed more readers who could handle the language. By funding Arabic teaching on the island, they hoped to make the knowledge in those manuscripts available to a wider circle of doctors and scholars. King Hugh IV of Cyprus did not only look eastward for soldiers, allies, and merchants. He also drew inspiration from the artistic world of Cairo. One of the most striking examples is a large brass basin from his court, now in the Louvre. It is a heavy, richly worked piece, once inlaid with gold and silver, wide and deep enough to dominate a reception room. Vessels of this type were also being produced in the first half of the 14th century for the Mamluk Sultan al-Nasir Muhammad, and the similarities are impossible to miss. The same bold, monumental script, the same confident handling of metal and engraving, and the same aesthetic language link Hugh's basin to another famous example now in St. Louis, made for one of al-Nasir Muhammad's officers. The craftsman who created the Cypriot piece clearly moved in that same artistic world. Their command of the calligraphic and demassining techniques of the Mamluk court suggests that they had been trained in Cairo workshops before working for a Christian monarch. What makes Hugh's commission remarkable is precisely this: a Latin king in the Eastern Mediterranean consciously adopting the visual language of a Muslim sultan's court. The basin, and others like it, produced for Christian patrons, were probably not made inside the sultan's own ateliers, but on Cyprus itself for Hugh, by artists steeped in Mamluk traditions. In doing this, Hugh seems to have been sending a message. By surrounding himself with objects that echoed the prestige of al-Nasir Muhammad's court, he was presenting himself as a ruler of comparable stature and refinement, almost unique among Western princes in the boldness of this cultural appropriation. Religious life created another dense web of connections between Cyprus and the lands ruled by the Mamluks. The Latin Church established on the island at the end of the 12th century possessed considerable wealth, and its resources were repeatedly drawn upon to support embattled Latin sees in the coastal cities of the Levant. As Muslim raids intensified and frontier castles came under pressure, popes diverted income from Cyprus to pay for walls and garrisons. The revenues of Nicosia and other Cypriot sees were temporarily assigned to the patriarchs of Antioch or Jerusalem when their own territories could no longer sustain them. After the final collapse of Latin rule in Syria in 1291, exiled chapters and bishops resettled on the island. the bishopric of Tortosa moved to Famagusta, its canons keeping their own chapter separate from that of the city, while the canons of Beirut found refuge in Nicosia. Titular patriarchs of Jerusalem took over former Templar estates in the Cypriot countryside after the order was dissolved, using the income to maintain a semblance of their old dignity in exile. For the papacy, Cyprus also remained a staging point for cautious attempts at contact with the Mamluk authorities regarding the holy places. Papal hopes occasionally flared that a sultan might be persuaded by negotiation to allow Latin clerics to return to Jerusalem's shrines. In one such episode, a Dominican patriarch of Jerusalem, living on Cyprus and drawing income from Cypriot villages and fines, was authorized to travel to Egypt to plead the case. He was given wide financial and administrative powers over his Cypriot lands to fund the journey, and even temporary charge of another Cypriot see. He did eventually reach the Nile, visited the holy places, and negotiated in the Muslim-ruled cities. But in the end, the Sultan refused to restore the sites. The Patriarch returned to the papal court without the breakthrough that Rome had hoped for. Cyprus's closeness to the coast of Palestine made it an obvious jumping-off point for pilgrimages. Popes gradually created a framework in which Latin pilgrims could, under controlled conditions, visit shrines now under Muslim rule. King Hugh IV received permission to send trusted envoys and observers into neighboring Muslim lands, ostensibly to explore them. Similar licenses allowed him to dispatch friars attached to his household. It is hard to avoid the impression that these missions also collected intelligence. From the 1320s onward, papal letters regularly granted archbishops of Nicosia, local clergy, and laypeople permission to travel to the Holy Land, on condition that no banned strategic materials, such as weapons or ship timber, were used to fund their journeys. Soon, the archbishop was given the power to absolve pilgrims who had already visited the shrines without prior papal license, in return for a fine, sparing them the risks and expense of a trip to Avignon just to regularize their status. Over time, securing papal approval for a pilgrimage from Cyprus became a routine matter. Infrastructure to care for these travelers developed in parallel. Hospices and hospitals for pilgrims were founded with papal blessing and supported by donations from merchants and nobles on Cyprus. A Genoese merchant secured permission to endow a chapel in a hospital he had founded for pilgrims, ensuring they could be cared for and buried there. A women-run hospital on Mount Zion, following a Franciscan rule and badly damaged during Muslim reprisals after King Peter's attack on Alexandria, received fundraising support directed from Cyprus. The Archbishop of Nicosia was empowered to collect alms for its repair, and indulgences were promised to those who contributed to rebuilding it. In this same period, Famagusta became a crossroads not just of trade, but of Christian intellectual traffic between Latin Europe and the Arabic-speaking East. One extraordinary figure was the Spanish Dominican Alfonso Buenombre. Fluent in Arabic and deeply interested in Eastern Christianity, he settled in Famagusta and took up the work of translator and mediator that he had already begun in Egypt. There he had entered Coptic monasteries and libraries, and on Cyprus he continued seeking out Arabic manuscripts. In the city's Coptic monastery of St. Anthony, he discovered a life of the saint in Arabic and translated it into Latin, sending the finished work to a cardinal in the papal curia. His goal was not simply scholarly. Buenombre was acutely aware that mendicant friars in Famagusta did not know Arabic, and he lamented the gulf separating Eastern and Western Christians. Arabic-speaking believers had no access to the writings of Latin theologians such as Thomas Aquinas or Isidore of Seville, while Latin clerics could not read the teachings of Egyptian desert fathers or Ephraim the Syrian. By translating and commenting on such works, he hoped to build a bridge across this divide, a role mirrored by other multilingual traders and scholars mentioned in contemporary correspondence. Religious encounters were not always friendly. Cyprus and the Mamluk lands were also linked through an intense tradition of polemical writing. One of the sharpest examples was a text known as the Letter from the People of Cyprus. The core of this work began as a treatise by a Melkite bishop from Sidon who addressed a Muslim acquaintance directly, claiming to have traveled through Christian lands to learn what they thought about Islam. He argued, through a blend of reasoning and selective citation of the Quran, that Islam in fact pointed toward Christian truths. According to his reading, the sacred text, properly interpreted, supported belief in the Trinity, the dual nature of Christ, and the Incarnation. He further maintained that Muhammad's message was intended only for the unlettered tribal Arabs as a step toward preparing them for the gospel. Rather than as a universal final revelation, Muslim scholars quickly took notice. Some, like the jurist al-Kharafi, composed detailed refutations. In the early 14th century, the work was rewritten and sharpened. An anonymous author, fully at home in Arabic, clearly steeped in both Quranic exegesis and Arabic Bible translations, revised the original. He removed much of the older writer's reasoning, corrected earlier distortions of Quranic verses, and added many new quotations from both the Quran and the Bible. His aim was to produce a more rigorous argument that would be harder for Muslim critics to dismiss. This revised letter was then sent from Cyprus to prominent religious scholars in Damascus, including Ibn Taymiyyah and another theologian known as al-Dimashqi. The latter replied quickly, composing a thorough rebuttal that drew entirely on Quranic argument. His answer, preserved in only one manuscript, seems to have circulated only modestly, but the exchange shows that Christian communities with roots in Syria, but now living in Cyprus, were actively engaging in high-level religious debate aimed at undermining Islam's claims. Ibn Taymiyyah also took up the challenge. In his major work on Christian-Muslim controversy, often translated as The Right Answer, he devoted long sections to dismantling the assertions of the Cypriot letter. But he had already sketched his main themes in an earlier piece addressed to a Christian noble associated with Cyprus, a work that later came to be known as the Cypriot letter. In that text, he presented Islam as a balanced path between what he saw as the harsh exclusivity of Judaism and the excessive softness of Christianity. Drawing on a tripartite Sufi language of majesty, beauty, and perfection, he described Moses as embodying majesty and severity, Jesus as embodying beauty and compassion, and Muhammad as bringing perfection by uniting both qualities. The letter sharply criticized practices Ibn Taymiyyah associated with contemporary Christianity, tales of crosses hanging miraculously in midair, weeping icons, and the holy fire ceremony in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which he dismissed as deception. He accused Christians of abandoning the duty of jihad, arguing that Muslims were justified in waging war against Christians because they had corrupted God's religion, whereas Christians had no divine mandate at all to attack those who followed what he regarded as the true faith of Abraham. He even cited a passage from the prophet Habakkuk as a veiled biblical announcement of Muhammad's coming. In closing, he appealed directly to the conscience of his Cypriot addressee Muslim captives held on the island, he insisted, had been taken unjustly. While Muslims were right to fight, Christians could claim no such right. He urged the recipient to treat Muslim prisoners humanely and to refrain from attempting to convert them. Behind this plea lay an implicit acknowledgement that conversion did sometimes occur among captives on Cyprus, and that the spiritual battlefield there, like the military one, was very real. Commerce between Lusignan Cyprus and the Mamluk domains in Egypt and Syria never really stopped, even in periods when it was officially forbidden. Already in 1232, after the Genoese had helped the Ibelin faction win the civil war on the island, they secured permanent trading rights in Famagusta by treaty with King Henry I, obtaining shops in the port that faced the Syrian coast. Church leaders tried to stem the flow of sensitive materials. In 1251, the Latin Archbishop of Nicosia, Hugh of Fagiano, thundered against false Christians who shipped timber, weapons, and iron to Muslim lands, echoing papal bans that had been in force since the 12th century. His successor, Archbishop Ranulf, repeated the prohibition in 1280, and later Greek versions of the Assizes for the burgesses listed such exports among the gravest crimes. In reality, these measures could not stop the trade. Like Cilician Armenia, Cyprus supplied the Mamluks with exactly the raw materials they lacked at home, particularly timber and metals for their fleets and armies. When the Mamluks began to seize the last Latin-held coastal towns of Syria and Palestine between 1260 and 1291, culminating in the fall of Acre and Tyre, many Latin and Syrian Christian refugees fled to Cyprus, with Famagusta absorbing a large share of this displaced population. By the early 14th century, that city had emerged as the main harbor of the Lusignan Kingdom, well placed opposite Alexandria, the Egyptian and Syrian coasts, and the key ports of the eastern Mediterranean. In 1291, Pope Nicholas IV tried to strike at the Mamluk economy by announcing a 10-year embargo on Christian trade with their lands, under penalty of excommunication. Later popes renewed bans on exporting strategic goods. In practice, however, this strategy played into Cypriot hands. As one modern historian has neatly put it, a blockade enforced by those who stood to lose from it could never be very effective. The Lusignan authorities applied the rules strictly enough when it came to Western merchants sailing directly to Egypt or Syria, but quietly tolerated and even facilitated trading ventures mounted from Cyprus itself. Latin, Greek, and Syrian merchants based on the island became intermediaries between Muslim buyers seeking timber, metals, cloth, and weapons, and Western buyers hungry for spices, silks, and slaves arriving from the Mamluk ports. Rome thundered repeatedly in 1320, 1323, and 1324, condemning such traffic, yet at the same time a more pragmatic system evolved. Traders who had fallen under excommunication for illicit commerce could buy absolution with money, or by serving for a time in campaigns against the infidel. From the later 1320s onward, the papacy went further and issued licenses that permitted trade in non-strategic products in exchange for a fee. A merchant's handbook compiled around 1320s gives a vivid glimpse of this traffic. It lists the colors and qualities of Cypriot camlets, a fine woolen cloth destined for different Mamluk ports. Emerald green, pistachio, pale green, yellow, azure, and white fabrics went to Alexandria, Cairo, and Damietta in smaller quantities, while Damascus and Beirut took large shipments in all colors. Tripoli preferred emerald, pistachio, and white, while Latakia received green, white, and a handful of pistachio pieces, even after Cyprus became a Mamluk tributary in 1426. These camlets continued to flow eastward and were formally included in the yearly tribute shipment down to the Ottoman conquest of Egypt and Syria in the early 16th century. The embargo regime could not last. After 1335, political turmoil in Iran and in the Tatar lands of southern Russia disrupted the overland caravan routes that had carried Eastern goods to Europe, harming Venetian and Genoese interests under pressure. Pope Clement VI softened his stance. In 1343, he empowered the Bishop of Paphos, acting as papal tax collector, to absolve Cypriot merchants who had traded forbidden goods to Alexandria and other banned ports in return for appropriate financial penalties. Excommunication would be reduced to a penitential sentence. The following year, the general ban on trade with Muslims was lifted. From then on, Venetians and Catalans could again send regular galley convoys to Mamluk harbors with papal approval. This revival of direct routes undercut the profitable middleman position Cyprus had enjoyed. Venetian records show that between 1357 and 1359, more galleys were outfitted for Alexandria than for Famagusta, and only about half of the state galleys heading east any given year called at Cypriot ports. Fewer ships meant fewer customs revenues, for the Lusignan treasury complaints soon surfaced that people were fraudulently claiming Venetian status or disguising the true ownership of cargoes to benefit from Venetian tax exemptions. Tensions with Genoa over similar issues brought the two powers to the brink of war in 1364, and the Compromise of 1365 contained clauses that many on Cyprus found demeaning. A long-running dispute flared around the fiscal privileges of Eastern Christians under Venetian or Genoese protection, the so-called White Venetians and White Genoese, who claimed immunity from local dues, while royal officials tried to tax them like other residents. This erosion of Cypriot commercial advantages and customs income formed part of the background to King Peter I's dramatic but ill-judged attack on Alexandria in 1365. Facing shrinking revenues and competition from Italian merchants trading directly with Egypt and Syria, the king seized on a papally proclaimed crusade as an opportunity to strike at his economic rival under the banner of holy war. The result was disastrous. A flashy but short-lived sack of the city, followed by a costly war with the Mamluks that weakened Cyprus further and alienated both Venice and Genoa, whose trading interests had been damaged under pressure from those same maritime powers. The king eventually authorized their envoys to negotiate peace with the Mamluk Sultan on his behalf. Among the issues on the Lusignan side was the status of the Cypriot trading house in Alexandria, known colloquially as the Khan of Moses. Like the fondity reserved for other Western nations in Muslim ports, it served as a combined warehouse, residence, and legal enclave for merchants and travelers. Cypriots living there came under the jurisdiction of their own consul in disputes that did not involve bloodshed, just as Venetians, Provençals, Catalans, and others enjoyed consular protection in Cyprus. After peace was ratified in 1370, a year after Peter's murder, commercial exchanges revived, and the subsequent Genoese occupation of Famagusta in 1373 only pushed Cypriot traders to rely even more heavily on Egyptian bases. By the early 15th century, we can trace Cypriot activity in Mamluk cities through notarial records. In Alexandria, we find women like Maria of Cyprus, an innkeeper who lent money to a man from Famagusta named George de Leono. She is likely the same Mariona of Cyprus, who appears in a 1421 document about the sale of dozens of casks of Cretan wine to tavern keepers in Alexandria. Although not explicitly labeled an innkeeper in that text, her purchase of wine alongside them strongly suggests she ran a similar establishment. Other records reveal a small but active Cypriot community. Peter Zexomeno, a Greek from Cyprus, served as the island's consul there. His son, James, married an Abyssinian slave named Maria, who had been freed and endowed with a dowry by her master on the day of the wedding. Cypriot ships visiting the harbor appear frequently in these acts. A similar pattern is visible in Beirut, where an Arab chronicler notes that from the mid-14th century onward, Frankish vessels began cautiously to frequent the port, again for trade. The king of Cyprus sent goods on 2 ships that followed one another to Beirut, and a group of Cypriots settled there permanently. They opened taverns and presses and maintained their own church, though the precise denomination is unknown. The Mamluk conquest of Cyprus in 1426 and the island's reduction to tributary status, paradoxically, gave fresh impetus to Cypriot exports. Tribute was paid partly in produce. In addition to camlets, the kingdom sent silks, woolens, and cloth to make up any deficit in the agreed quantity or quality of textiles. Cotton and a lighter cloth known as bocasine moved both ways. Syrian cotton reached Europe via Cyprus and supplied local looms, while Cypriot cotton and bocasine went back to European markets. Genoese customs figures for the late 1370s suggest that more of these fabrics were arriving from Cyprus than directly from Mamluk ports. Both regions produced sugar, but Cypriot sugar was generally cheaper and became increasingly attractive in Egyptian and Syrian markets, including lower-grade molasses. Venetian records from the 1470s mention galleys stopping at Famagusta specifically to take on Cypriot sugar before proceeding to Beirut, and early 16th century diaries still list sugar, syrup, and honey from Cyprus among exports to Syrian ports. Economic and monetary developments in the Mamluk realm played into Cypriot hands. In Egypt and Syria, sugar production was hampered by outdated technology, by monopolies granted to factories owned by the Sultan and leading emirs, and by corrupt management of those state enterprises. At the same time, large outflows of silver to Europe and the adoption of copper-based coinage in the early 15th century fueled inflation. All of this reduced the competitiveness of Mamluk sugar and textiles relative to Cypriot goods. On the other side of the equation, fluctuations in agricultural output created opportunities for grain trade. Wheat cultivation in Egypt and Syria declined over the 15th century, giving way increasingly to barley. Yet both grains continued to be exported to Cyprus. Whenever the island suffered poor harvests, Coptic merchants were among the intermediaries in this trade. After Cyprus became a vassal of the Sultan in 1426, the flow reversed as well. The kingdom regularly shipped wheat and barley to Egypt, fulfilling treaty obligations noted by travelers such as Pero Tafur in the 1430s. Many other goods moved along these routes. Mastic from Chios reached Cyprus, where Jewish traders from that island helped sell it. Genoese-held Famagusta acted as a distribution hub for onward trade to Syria and Egypt. Cypriot salt, already mentioned by Tafur as a staple export to Mamluk ports, continued to be shipped there, according to later observers. One Venetian writer in 1510 remarked that many of the island's poor owed their livelihood to these trading links with Syria. Genoese merchants based in Famagusta and Nicosia imported pepper from Egypt, while soap produced in Egyptian and Syrian factories found markets in Cyprus. We know that Venetian merchants in Alexandria sold soap directly to King Janus, and that Coptic traders working with Genoese partners in Nicosia did business with North African interpreters, selling them soap and other goods. Copts themselves became part of this Cypriot Mamluk world. They probably began to settle on the island in noticeable numbers from the later 14th century, although some may have arrived earlier. Harsh measures taken against Egyptian Copts after Peter I's Alexandrian raid may have encouraged some to seek refuge on Cyprus, but the evidence is fragmentary. What we do know is that by 1483, there was a Coptic bishop on the island, Anba Michael, who later became Metropolitan of Rhodes, a sign that the community was both large and organized enough to require its own episcopal leadership. Coptic scribes were active in copying and editing manuscripts, and by the early 16th century, there was a Coptic church in Nicosia, dedicated to Saint Benham II, mid-15th century wills, from members of the Syrian origin Audeth family, mention bequests to the four churches of the Copts, almost certainly referring to the Coptic Cathedral of St. Anthony in Nicosia, the Church of St. Benham, a Coptic Church of St. Anthony in Famagusta, and the Monastery of St. Macarius at Klima, near the village of Platani, north of the capital. This monastery alone received a vast legacy of 2,000 ducats from the prominent Copt Sir Hannah Christodoulou, who died in 1518. The monastery of St. Macarius appears again in a letter from the Venetian Council of Ten, dated May 1539. The Venetian authorities, now ruling Cyprus directly, praised the monks' austere lifestyle and regular worship, and granted funds for new buildings to accommodate their growing numbers. By then, 16 monks, up from only 4. The same letter reveals Venetian interest in the Arabic medical manuscripts housed there, as officials hoped to have them read and put to use. Not everyone was sympathetic to the Copts, however. Writing in 1580, long after the Ottoman conquest had ended both Lusignan and Venetian rule, the Dominican friar Stephen de Lusignan described them as stubborn and opinionated, though he grudgingly admitted that their discipline was strict. Their presence, like that of other Eastern Christian groups, was one more sign of how deeply entangled Cyprus had become with the religious and economic life of the Mamluk world that faced it across the sea. Muslims and Christians from the Mamluk realms also made their way to Cyprus, though often in very different ways and under very different pressures. During the succession struggle between Queen Charlotte and her half-brother James, the illegitimate son of King John II, James secured his victory with the help of Circassian Mamluk auxiliaries. Some of these soldiers were killed in the brutal clashes that followed the capture of Famagusta, but others entered Cypriot service and stayed figures like John the Circassian, the Emir Kurkuma, and the Mamluk Tagribirdi received fiefs from James as rewards for their loyalty. Many of them kept their Muslim faith, yet they also married local women, and their descendants blended into Cypriot society while still remembering their Circassian roots. In later Venetian records, we find Peter and Bernard Circasso, sons of John the Circassian, listed as fief holders. Another of John's sons died in 1501 fighting Ottoman raiders when 12 Turkish ships attacked Lapithos on the northern coast. 16th century Venetian documents mention Thomas, Geronimo, and Paris Circasso, almost certainly members of the same family. Geronimo Circasso appears in a 1560 list of feudatories, bearing the title Magnifico, clear proof that at least one man of Circassian origin had risen into the island's nobility. Others of similar background held less exalted but still important posts. The interpreter Michel Membre, who later worked in Venice, claimed Circassian ancestry, and an official known as Battista Mameluco who served as market inspector in the Karpas Peninsula sometime before 1559, was clearly descended from former Mamluks. Not everyone who crossed between Cyprus and the Mamluk territories did so freely. The constant movement of slaves on both sides, often seized in war, is a stark reminder of that reality. In 1271, when the fleet sent by Sultan Baybars to attack Cyprus ran aground near Limassol, more than 1,800 Muslims were taken captive. Many of them were shipped to Acre in the hope of ransom. When negotiations stalled, the prisoners managed a daring escape. Their guards, bribed in advance, smuggled in saws and files that allowed them to break their chains and flee. Later writers also speak of Muslim captives on the island. Ibn Taymiyyah, in a letter written in the first years of the 14th century, complained about Muslims being held in Cyprus, and a German pilgrim, Ludolf of Suchen, who visited the island a few decades later, described a vineyard known as Engadi in the Paphos district, where the Templars once employed over 100 Muslim slaves to work the vines daily, before the order was dissolved in 1312. Christians shared the same fate when fortune turned against them. When the Templars on the small island of Ruud finally surrendered in 1302, after resisting a Mamluk siege, some were massacred on the spot, and the rest were carried off to Cairo. A Genoese witness later testified in the Templar trials on Cyprus that these prisoners spent close to 10 years in harsh imprisonment, deprived of food and water, yet preferred death or beheading to giving up their faith. The large-scale raiding carried out from Cyprus against the coasts of Egypt and Syria in the early 15th century added another grim chapter to this story. In 1415, King Janus of Cyprus returned from a raid with 1,500 Muslim captives, according to the Cretan observer Emmanuel Piloti. These men were sent to work in the royal sugar estates. When an envoy from the Mamluk Sultan arrived to demand their release, Janus replied bluntly that he needed more laborers, not fewer. Yet the picture was not entirely one of unrelenting brutality. In 1414, after a temporary truce, a Muslim emir visiting Cyprus successfully negotiated the release of 535 Muslim prisoners. The king himself personally paid the ransom for 135 of them. A few years later, the Venetian government instructed its consuls in both Damascus and Cyprus to buy back large numbers of Muslim slaves purchased by the Venetian noble John Corner, most likely to supply workers for his family's sugar estate at Episcopi near Limassol. After the devastating Mamluk invasion of 1426, these raids for slaves ceased. The tables then turned. Former Muslim captives living as Christians on the island slipped out of Nicosia and other towns to avoid being recognized and punished as apostates by the conquering armies. Between 1424 and 1425, the Mamluks captured more than 1,000 Cypriots in coastal raids and carried them off. Some prisoners were executed when they refused to embrace Islam. Others were sold in the slave markets. After the full-scale invasion of 1426 and the fall of Nicosia, between 2,000 and 6,000 islanders were taken away to Egypt, depending on which source one reads. Papal letters appealed to churches in Spain, France, England, and Italy to raise funds for their ransom, and some captives were indeed redeemed and allowed to return home. Yet many others disappeared into slavery, some eventually converting to Islam, others dying rather than abandon their Christian faith. Across these centuries, the ties between Lusignan Cyprus and the Mamluk Sultanate, which controlled Egypt, Syria, and the Holy Land, formed a dense web of encounters. They cut across religious, linguistic, and ethnic lines, and were constantly shaped by the interventions of outside powers, from the Mongols in the early 14th century to Venice from the later 15th century onward. Geography played its part. The shores of Cyprus, Egypt, and Syria faced each other across a relatively narrow stretch of sea, and ships moved between them in a matter of days. Time also mattered. The relationship stretched across the whole span of the Mamluk state, from its birth in the mid-13th century to its destruction by the Ottomans in 1517. In the first phase, both sides dealt with each other as independent states, sometimes trading, sometimes fighting. After the Mamluk victory in 1426 and the humiliation of King Janus, the balance changed. Cyprus became a vassal kingdom, obligated to pay tribute and navigate its policies with constant reference to Cairo. Even when Venice stepped in and effectively took control of Cyprus in the late 15th century, the island remained a tributary, first to the Mamluks, and after 1517, to the Ottoman sultans. Only with the Ottoman conquest of Cyprus itself in 1570 did this long chapter close. From that point on, Cyprus and the former Mamluk lands were brought under a single imperial authority, and the political landscape of the eastern Mediterranean was transformed beyond recognition.